Welcome to the past unveiled, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now let's begin with Story 1. A gate opens to Europe. You are standing on the crumbling walls of Constantinople, high above the Bosphorus Strait. The spring of 1453 is unusually warm. Below you, the waters shimmer with the reflection of ships, some Christian, many Muslim. Inside the city, weary citizens barter for bread, priests chant in deserted churches, and the emperor's guards patrol streets that have grown far too quiet. You can almost hear the wind whispering the names of lost empires. The once glorious capital of the Eastern Roman Empire is a shadow of itself. This is where the last chapter of a thousand-year-old civilization begins to end. The Eastern Roman legacy. Constantinople had stood for over a millennium, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a continuation of the Roman Empire in the East. It had faced Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Crusaders. It had been rebuilt after fires, sacked in 1204, and somehow limped into the 15th century. But its glory days were over. The city's population had shrunk from hundreds of thousands to around 50,000. Whole districts had become overgrown ruins. The Hagia Sophia, once the largest church in the Christian world, stood largely intact but surrounded by decay. Yet even in this state, Constantinople remained the symbolic heart of Orthodox Christianity. Its significance was spiritual more than strategic by 1453. Politically, it was isolated. Economically, it was crumbling. Militarily, it was a relic. The rise of the Ottoman Crescent. Meanwhile, across the straits in Anatolia, a new power had been rising for over a century. The Ottomans were not yet the sprawling empire they would become, but they were well on their way. By the 15th century, they had conquered much of the Balkans, defeated several Christian coalitions, and forged a strong centralized power under the leadership of Sultan Mehmed II. Mehmed, who ascended the throne for the second time in 1451, was no ordinary monarch. Only 19 years old at the time, he was a devout Muslim, a scholar of ancient texts, and a strategist who combined force with diplomacy. His ambition was clear: to take Constantinople and fulfill the dream of generations of sultans before him. Mehmed was obsessed with Alexander the Great and the Roman emperors. He envisioned an empire that would bridge continents and faiths. For him, Constantinople wasn't just a city, it was the prize, the axis between East and West, Christian and Muslim, past and future. The walls of Theodosius. The city's greatest defense was its walls, particularly the famed Theodosian walls. These massive triple fortifications had held off every attacker for centuries. Crusaders had only breached the city by sea in 1204, and even then, with the help of internal betrayal. But Mehmed came prepared. He brought something new to the ancient game of siege warfare: massive cannons. With the help of a Hungarian engineer named Urban, he built bombard guns capable of hurling massive stone balls over a mile. These early superweapons were slow to reload and inaccurate, but their psychological effect was enormous. When the largest of them fired, its echo could be heard miles away. Still, Constantinople's defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI and aided by a small but brave band of Genoese, led by Giovanni Giustiniani, believed they could hold. The city had survived worse, they told themselves, but they underestimated Mehmed's persistence. The siege begins. On April 6, 1453, the Ottoman army encircled Constantinople. Estimates of Mehmed's army range from 60,000 to over 100,000 men, including janissaries, elite slave soldiers, Sipahi cavalry, and siege engineers. Against them stood about 7,000 defenders, some locals, some foreigners, many untrained. The Ottomans had one disadvantage. Their ships could not breach the chain that protected the Golden Horn, a natural harbor. So, in an astonishing feat of logistics, Mehmed had ships hauled overland on greased logs to bypass the barrier entirely. In a single night, the balance of the siege shifted. Inside the city, fear grew. Churches were filled with prayers and incense. Rumors spread of miracles, omens, and portents. The emperor walked among the people, often in full armor, trying to inspire calm. Supplies dwindled, morale frayed, but surrender was not considered, not for Constantinople. The emperor and the last stand. Constantine XI Palaiologos, the final Byzantine emperor, had no illusions. He was not a charismatic figure, nor a particularly effective ruler, but he understood symbolism. He refused to flee. In his final address to the people, he reminded them that they were fighting not just for a city, but for the memory of an empire, for faith, and for dignity. He took communion in the Hagia Sophia, and then rode to the walls to fight alongside his soldiers. His courage would be remembered long after his name was forgotten by most. Inside and outside the walls. The story of Constantinople is not just a tale of politics and military tactics, it is also about the daily struggles of the ordinary people caught in the siege. Merchants counted dwindling coins. Priests debated prophecies. Women cooked what little grain remained. Children played in alleyways while hearing the dull thud of cannon fire. Outside, Ottoman soldiers built siege towers, repaired broken guns, and maintained discipline. Many were volunteers seeking glory or spoils. Others were conscripts. All were aware they were on the cusp of history. Spiritual tension and unity. For perhaps the first time in centuries, the city's deep theological divides faded. Orthodox, Catholic, and even some non-Christian residents found themselves united by a shared fear and a faint hope. Religious leaders urged repentance, while astrologers looked to the stars for a sign. And all the while, Mehmed waited, planned, and slowly tightened the noose. Final preparations for the assault. By late May, the walls were buckling. The great cannon had shattered part of the outer defenses, but the defenders repaired them each night. Giustiniani had been wounded, weakening the city's key military leadership. Constantine still refused to surrender. Mehmed prepared for one final, massive assault. He promised his men 3 days of pillage if they succeeded. It was a brutal incentive, but effective. Drums beat day and night. Fires were lit. Tunnels were dug. And across the Golden Horn, citizens of the city watched, prayed, and waited. As the sun set on May 28, 1453, both sides readied themselves. Inside the Hagia Sophia, monks chanted what many knew would be the city's final liturgy. Constantine took his last communion. In a speech to his men, he declared, "I am prepared to die with you. I will not abandon this city." And then, at dawn on May 29, the final assault began. But what happened next? How did the Ottomans finally breach the mighty walls? What was the fate of the last emperor? And what did Mehmed do upon entering the greatest Christian city of the East? The night had been long and filled with dread. Inside the walls of Constantinople, sleep was elusive. Priests chanted in candlelit chapels and men sharpened rusted blades. On the outer walls, soldiers stood alert under moonlight, straining to hear the shuffle of Ottoman boots in the darkness. In the Sultan's camp, the night was filled with anticipation and noise, drums beating rhythmically, fires blazing, voices murmuring prayers, and horses packing. And then, just before dawn, the silence broke. The final assault begins. It started with a signal, a single booming drum followed by the war cries of thousands. The first wave was composed of irregulars, bashi-bazoks, often poorly trained and undisciplined, thrown into the fray to exhaust the defenders. They charged with fervor, battering the walls with ladders, only to be repelled with boiling oil, arrows, and rocks hurled from above. Their deaths were almost guaranteed, but their sacrifice served a grim purpose: to wear down the defenders' energy and resolve. Wave after wave followed. After the irregulars, Mehmed sent in Anatolian troops, more experienced fighters who pressed harder and managed to find weak spots in the wall. The defenders fought with desperate strength. Even the citizens joined in. Women carried water and arrows, children ran messages, priests blessed the dying. The defenders held, for a time. Giustiniani falls. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese mercenary who had taken command of the defense, had been a pillar of strength. His reputation as a seasoned commander had boosted morale, but during the height of the fighting, he was gravely wounded, likely in the chest or back, though accounts differ. His men, believing him dead or dying, began to falter. When Giustiniani was carried from the field, panic rippled through the defense lines like a poisoned wind. This was the moment Mehmed had been waiting for. The Janissaries enter the fray. With the defenders fatigued and their morale shaken, the Sultan released his elite, the Janissaries. Trained from childhood as slave soldiers, the Janissaries were disciplined, professional, and utterly loyal to the Sultan. Clad in chainmail and wielding scimitars and matchlocks, they moved as a unified force. They pressed toward the weakened section near the gate of St. Romanus. Finally, a small group of attackers found a sally port left open in the confusion, some say, a hidden door used for skirmishes or repairs. They slipped inside and raised the Ottoman banner on a nearby tower. From that moment, the defense unraveled. The last emperor's fate. Constantine XI had vowed not to flee. According to most sources, when he saw the walls breached and the city lost, he stripped off his imperial regalia and joined his men in hand-to-hand combat. He was last seen fighting near the Lycus River Gate. His body was never definitively identified. His death marked the end of the Roman Empire, not just the eastern half, but the idea of Rome itself. The empire that had begun with Augustus nearly 1,500 years earlier came to an end in a final, doomed sword fight. The pillaging of Constantinople. Mehmed had promised his troops 3 days of plunder. He kept his word. Once the city was breached, chaos reigned. Soldiers poured through the streets, looting homes, churches, and monasteries. Priceless relics were smashed or stolen. The Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque within hours, and its worshippers, clergy and laypeople alike, were either enslaved or killed. Accounts from survivors describe the horror in subdued tones. Children taken from their families, noblewomen led away in chains, sacred books trampled underfoot. Yet this was not exceptional cruelty by the standards of siege warfare. Mehmed, like emperors and kings before him, allowed looting as a tool of conquest and as payment. By the second day, however, Mehmed ordered a halt to the destruction. Mehmed enters the city. The Sultan entered Constantinople in full ceremonial dress, mounted on a white horse. He dismounted before the Hagia Sophia and, according to legend, sprinkled earth on his turban as a symbol of humility. Standing in the center of the shattered Christian world, he declared the city the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. He would soon take the title Caesari Rum Caesar of Rome, asserting his claim to the legacy of the fallen empire. Repopulation and reconstruction. Mehmed had no intention of ruling a corpse of a city. He quickly moved to restore order and repopulate the capital. Muslims, Christians, and Jews were all encouraged to settle there. Mehmed granted protections to Orthodox Christians and appointed a new patriarch, ensuring the continuation of religious life under Ottoman control. He reopened markets, rebuilt aqueducts, and turned Constantinople, now Istanbul, into a bustling imperial capital. Within a generation, it would become one of the most vibrant cities in the world, with traders from Venice, Cairo, and Persia crowding its bazaars. Europe's reaction. The fall of Constantinople shocked Europe, but not into unity. Many Christian states had refused to aid the Byzantines during the siege, citing past grievances, theological divisions, or political interests. Now, they faced a changed reality. The door to Europe was open. Pope Nicholas V called for a crusade, but enthusiasm was lacking. Western Europe was still recovering from the Hundred Years' War. In Central Europe, Hungary and Poland braced for an Ottoman advance. Venice and Genoa, who had long profited from trade with Byzantium, scrambled to negotiate new deals with maimed. But beneath the surface, something deeper was shifting. The idea that Christendom was no longer protected by divine right. The fortress of faith had fallen. The myth of Byzantine invincibility was gone. A symbolic turning point. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 is one of the most symbolically loaded events in world history. It marked the end of the Middle Ages for many historians. It sparked a new urgency in exploration. Some even argue that it helped drive Columbus to find a sea route to Asia, bypassing the now Ottoman-controlled land routes. But beyond geopolitics, the event was a human tragedy and transformation. A city that had resisted time itself finally gave way. Yet, from its ashes, something new emerged, a truly Eurasian empire that would challenge Europe for centuries. The world after the fall. As the years passed, many of the city's treasures vanished or were repurposed. Mosaics were plastered over, libraries were looted, artifacts disappeared into private collections or foreign vaults. The Byzantines became a memory often romanticized, misunderstood, or ignored. Yet the Ottoman Empire now stood at the heart of a shifting global order. With Istanbul as its jewel, the sultans could look west toward Europe and east toward Asia. They controlled trade, commanded fear, and represented a civilizational alternative to the Latin West. It was no longer a question of whether the Ottomans would rise, but how far they would go. And so, how did the Ottoman Empire use its new capital as a springboard for further conquests? What became of the Christian kingdoms that once laughed off the threat? And what role did Hungary and the Balkans play in holding the frontier? The fall of Constantinople did not occur in a vacuum. Like a tremor in a vast forest, the shock of May 29, 1453, reverberated across the Christian world and far beyond. It was not merely a local event, nor even a regional one. It altered the flow of power, commerce, and culture across continents. With the fall of the once mighty Byzantine capital, Europe now faced a powerful and expanding Islamic empire not on its distant borders, but inside the very fabric of its geopolitical neighborhood. A new center of power. The Ottomans did not hesitate. In the months following their victory, they turned Constantinople into a thriving capital. Sultan Mehmed II, now styled Fatih the Conqueror, quickly set about transforming the city. He ordered the repair of aqueducts, cleared rubble from the great forums, and established new mosques and palaces. Greek Christians were permitted to remain, albeit under restrictions. Mehmed re-established the Orthodox Patriarchate, an act of calculated tolerance that helped reduce resistance. Armenian Christians and Jews were invited to settle in the city, creating a complex, multi-ethnic society. Istanbul, as it was now called more frequently, became not only an Islamic capital but a cosmopolitan one. By securing both sides of the Bosphorus, the Ottomans commanded the gateway between Europe and Asia, an invaluable strategic and commercial position. From here, Mehmed could plan further campaigns, and more importantly, use the city's prestige to consolidate his rule over an empire that was growing larger, faster, and more centralized than anything Europe had seen in centuries. Europe's fragmented response. In Western Europe, the fall of Constantinople triggered mourning, sermons, and a surge in anti-Ottoman rhetoric. But these were words, not actions. The papacy issued calls for a crusade, but European monarchs were more concerned with internal power struggles than distant sieges. England was descending into the Wars of the Roses. France was exhausted from the Hundred Years' War. The Holy Roman Empire was fractured and slow-moving. Spain was still in the midst of the Reconquista. Poland and Hungary, by contrast, were immediately alarmed. They shared a border, or nearly so, with Ottoman-occupied lands in the Balkans. For them, the fall of Constantinople was not a distant concern, it was a prelude to potential invasion. Venice and Genoa, the great maritime republics, mourned the loss of trade privileges and Byzantine allies. But they quickly began negotiating with the new power, securing economic treaties with Maimed in exchange for tribute and naval cooperation. This disunity would prove critical to the Ottomans' continued expansion. While Europe mourned, debated, and hesitated, Maimed acted. Balkan absorption. With Constantinople secure, Maimed turned his attention west and north. Over the next 2 decades, he absorbed what remained of the Byzantine successor states, the Despotate of Mora in the Peloponnese, the Empire of Trebizond, and various Latin and Orthodox outposts in Greece. Serbia had already become an Ottoman vassal before 1453, but after the death of its ruler Dured Brankovic, Maimed moved in force. By 1459, Serbia was fully incorporated into the empire. The fortresses along the Danube now stood as the final line before the Great Plains of Hungary. In Bosnia, a similar fate unfolded. Despite desperate attempts to secure aid from Western Europe, the Kingdom of Bosnia fell to the Ottomans in 1463. The king, Stephen Tomašević, was executed reportedly with Maimed himself present at the beheading. These swift, methodical conquests showed that the fall of Constantinople had not been the climax, it was merely the opening act of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. Hungary, Europe's new frontline. Of all the European powers, Hungary was now the most exposed. The Kingdom of Hungary, large and relatively wealthy, was suddenly on the front lines. The Danube became the main buffer, its fortresses transformed from commercial ports into war garrisons. Hungary began building and reinforcing a vast network of border defenses, a military frontier known as the Antemurale Christianitatis, or the bulwark of Christendom. Yet this military preparation came with its own burdens. Maintaining fortresses, armies, and defenses consumed a huge portion of Hungary's resources. Nobles squabbled over control of frontier regions, and while leaders like John Hunyadi launched daring counterattacks, the long-term strategy was simply to hold the line, not to push the Ottomans back. As the decades passed, Hungary's position would become more precarious. When the Ottomans returned in force in the 16th century, the results would be catastrophic. But that chapter had not yet been written in 1453. An empire in motion. The Ottoman Empire, energized by the fall of Constantinople, evolved rapidly. Maimed initiated a series of reforms to centralize authority. Local beyliks, Turkish principalities, were subdued or integrated. Lands were redistributed through the timur system, granting land to loyal soldiers in exchange for military service. The devshirme system, or child levy, expanded. Christian boys were taken from the Balkans, converted to Islam, and trained as janissaries, forming a state within a state, a standing army directly loyal to the Sultan. The empire's bureaucracy also grew more complex and efficient. Maimed introduced new legal codes, restructured the treasury, and encouraged scholars to translate Greek and Latin works into Arabic and Turkish. This internal organization, far from boring, was essential to the empire's endurance. While other empires fractured under the weight of conquest, the Ottomans built systems to manage diversity, suppress dissent, and maintain a unified imperial vision. Long-term cultural impact. The fall of Constantinople also had significant ripple effects on intellectual and cultural life. Greek scholars fleeing the city brought manuscripts, knowledge, and philosophical traditions to the West. This movement helped fuel the European Renaissance. Ironically, while the event marked the end of one classical tradition in the East, it helped revive another in the West. In the Islamic world, Constantinople became a symbol of triumph and legitimacy. Mosques modeled after the Hagia Sophia soon dotted the empire. Poets celebrated the city's conquest as the fulfillment of the Prophet Muhammad's prophecy, "Verily you shall conquer Constantinople. What a wonderful leader will he be, and what a wonderful army will that army be." The city became a magnet for scholars, jurists, and artisans. Within a century, it would rival Baghdad and Cairo as a center of Islamic learning and culture. What was lost? Amid all the strategic reshaping, one should not forget the quieter, more human losses. Monasteries burned, tombs desecrated, generations of manuscripts some never copied were lost to time. The stories of the city's merchants, artisans, and clergy, written on scraps of paper or spoken aloud in crumbling houses, vanished. Even the Byzantine bureaucracy, renowned for its complexity, left behind few complete records of its final decades. What we know of these final moments comes largely from foreign observers: Venetians, Genoese, or Ottomans themselves. The Byzantine Empire had been reduced to a legend, and with it, much of the memory of Eastern Roman daily life vanished. Who baked the city's bread in 1453? What songs were sung by children as the walls shook? These are questions we cannot answer, not fully. The shift in global trade. The conquest of Constantinople also disrupted trade routes. For centuries, European merchants had relied on overland routes passing through Byzantium to reach the silk and spice markets of Asia. Now, those routes were controlled by the Ottomans, who charged high tolls or restricted access altogether. This spurred European interest in finding sea routes to Asia, bypassing the Ottomans altogether. Within decades, Portuguese explorers would round the Cape of Good Hope, and Columbus would set sail across the Atlantic. So in a strange twist, the fall of Constantinople, an event so steeped in loss and collapse, helped birth a new global age of exploration and connection. A legacy of walls. Today, remnants of the Theodosian walls still stand in Istanbul. Tourists walk their length, unaware of the sieges, prayers, and blood spilled at their foundations. The Hagia Sophia, turned from church to mosque to museum and back again, remains a symbol of contested memory. The fall of Constantinople is often portrayed as a sudden cataclysm, but in truth, it was the end of a long decay and the beginning of a new imperial story. The Ottomans would not just replace the Byzantines. They would absorb them, reshape them, and challenge the rest of Europe with a new political, cultural, and military model. It was not the end of history, it was its turning. Final reflection. The fall of Constantinople marked the conclusion of a 1,000-year Roman experiment in the East. Yet it also ignited centuries of Ottoman dominance, threatened European borders, transformed global trade, and sparked cultural migrations that reshaped the West. It was not just a siege, it was a pivot. What then would Europe do in the face of this new power? Would it adapt, resist, or slowly fracture? And in the centuries that followed, who would become the new defenders of the West? Story 2. The Long War for Central Europe. You are standing on the high walls of Belgrade Fortress in the mid-15th century. The Danube glimmers below, its wide waters dividing Christian Europe from the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire. Behind you, the spires of Hungarian cathedrals and stone houses pierce the morning mist. Before you, the sounds of horses, cannons, and disciplined chants echo from across the water. The Ottomans have arrived again. Hungary, once nestled deep in Europe, now finds itself transformed into a frontier kingdom, a battered but stubborn bulwark pressed against the surging tide of Ottoman ambition. This is not a single war, but a long war stretching across generations. It is a war of forts, raids, taxation, and alliances. A war where emperors hesitate and local lords bear the cost. The shape of the kingdom. In the 15th century, the Kingdom of Hungary was among the largest and wealthiest states in Europe. Its territory included modern-day Hungary, Slovakia, parts of Romania, Croatia, northern Serbia, and even segments of modern Austria. It was a realm of wide plains, forested mountains, fortified towns, and an aristocracy proud of its warrior tradition. The Hungarian crown had long been a prize, fought over by foreign dynasties, local claimants, and even the papacy. But in the decades after the fall of Constantinople, it assumed a new role, first line of defense for Europe. This came at a terrible cost. John Hunyadi, the defender of Belgrade. Hungary's transformation into a militarized frontier began under the leadership of John Hunyadi, a noble of Wallachian descent who rose through military merit. Hunyadi, a seasoned general and devout Christian, saw the Ottoman threat clearly. While Western monarchs debated theology or plotted against rivals, Hunyadi raised troops, fortified the southern borders, and led daring campaigns into Ottoman territory. His greatest moment came in 1456 at the Siege of Belgrade. Belgrade, the key fortress on the Danube, was under siege by Sultan Mehmed II fresh from his conquest of Constantinople. Hunyadi, with limited resources and an army of professional soldiers, peasants, and crusading volunteers, managed to repel the Ottoman assault in a brutal, bloody confrontation. The turning point came when a Franciscan monk, Giovanni da Capistrano, led a wave of poorly armed peasants in a surprise sortie against the Ottoman siege lines. Hunyadi followed with a more organized counterattack, and the Ottoman lines collapsed. Mehmed was wounded, and the Ottomans were forced to retreat. For a time, Europe breathed easier. Church bells rang throughout Christendom in celebration, a tradition that continues today at noon in many cities, commemorating that victory. But the war was far from over. A line of fire, the military frontier. After Hunyadi's death, Hungary continued to pour resources into the southern border. Fortresses, some ancient Roman, others newly built, formed a defensive arc from the Adriatic to the Carpathians. Each garrison was manned by a mix of professional soldiers, local peasants, and mercenaries. The cost was enormous. The crown levied new taxes, often resisted by nobles. Castles had to be stocked with gunpowder, food, and cannons. Roads were reinforced to allow troop movement. A form of militarized society began to emerge, particularly in southern Hungary and Slavonia, where daily life revolved around raids, alerts, and skirmishes. Villagers kept watchtowers on hills. Fires and smoke were used as warning signals. Armies rarely marched in full campaigns. This was a war of attrition, punctuated by devastating raids that destroyed harvests, stole livestock, and took captives. In many towns, border guards were paid partly in grain, and rights to tax local markets, a reflection of the kingdom's limited cash flow and deeply feudal character. Meanwhile, Ottoman raiders, often supported by vassal states like the Crimean Khanate, grew bolder. Royal struggles and noble resistance. While the people bore the brunt of frontier life, the crown imbued a struggle with internal politics. The Hungarian nobility was powerful and fiercely independent. Kings were often elected rather than inherited. Foreign dynasties, like the Habsburgs, eyed the crown with increasing interest. The lack of unity made long-term planning difficult. While some nobles supported reforms and increased taxation to fund the army, others resisted, fearing the loss of their privileges. The Diet of Hungary, the National Assembly, frequently argued over the funding of fortresses. At times, the very men who controlled the borders were left without pay or supplies. Local commanders improvised, creating small-scale economies around each fortress, trading with merchants, taxing markets, and sometimes even negotiating temporary truces with Ottoman leaders. This fragile balance often collapsed during periods of weak royal leadership. Matthias Corvinus, the warrior king. The strongest post-Hunyadi ruler was Matthias Corvinus, the son of John Hunyadi. Elected king in 1458, Matthias was a unique figure, a scholar, a military reformer, and one of the few monarchs of his time who truly understood the Ottoman threat. Matthias built a standing army, the Black Army, one of the first professional militaries in Europe. It included mercenaries, artillery units, and disciplined cavalry. He centralized royal authority, increased taxation, and reduced the influence of the aristocracy, moves that earned him enemies at home, but strengthened the kingdom overall. While he spent much of his reign campaigning in Bohemia and Austria, he never lost sight of the Ottoman frontier. Under his rule, Hungary saw relative stability along its southern borders. Matthias invested in infrastructure, built new roads, and encouraged the settlement of depopulated frontier zones. He also corresponded with rulers across Europe, urging them to prepare for a united defense against the Ottomans. Few listened. Life along the border. To understand the depth of Hungary's sacrifice, one must look beyond kings and generals to the people who lived and died in the shadow of the crescent. In frontier villages, peasants learned to fight. Churches were built like fortresses, with narrow slits for arrows. Entire communities could vanish in a single night, taken in Ottoman slave raids that fed the markets of Edirne and Constantinople. But there was resilience too. Women often ran the villages when men were at war. Children were taught not just prayers and farming, but when to run, where to hide, and how to shoot a bow. Villagers developed coded whistles and songs that served as warnings. Shepherds acted as scouts. Blacksmiths doubled as armorers. And despite the devastation, trade continued. Border markets sprang up, where Hungarian and Ottoman merchants sometimes illegally exchanged goods under informal truces. Grain, cloth, wine, and livestock flowed in both directions, even as armies clashed nearby. These stories are rarely told. They lack the drama of great battles, but they define the experience of an entire generation and built the foundation of Hungary's frontier identity. Cracks in the wall. By the early 1500s, signs of strain were clear. The Black Army had been disbanded after Matthias's death. Internal divisions grew. Nobles again resisted royal authority. Corruption flourished in fortress administration. Some garrisons were left unpaid for months. In others, commanders turned to extortion to stay afloat. Meanwhile, the Ottomans were growing stronger. New sultans Bayezid II and later Suleiman the Magnificent refined their military machine. Artillery improved. Roads were built across the Balkans. Ottoman infrastructure was becoming imperial, not just martial. The Hungarian border, once a line of steel and discipline, was becoming brittle. And then, in 1521, the Ottomans attacked Belgrade again. This time it fell swiftly. Hungary's great fortress had become a hollow symbol, undermanned and undersupplied. The road to Buda and beyond was open. What followed was one of the most significant battles in European history. But how did Hungary prepare for what was to come? And what would happen at Mohacs, where an empire would collide with a kingdom on its knees? It is the year 1526. On a plain near the village of Mohacs, the sun hangs low over a field soon to be marked by smoke and blood. The Hungarian nobility, glittering in splendid armor and fine silks, line up for battle. Across the plain, the vast army of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent waits with cold discipline. As drums beat and flags flutter, the final act of a century-long decline is about to unfold. But to understand how Hungary reached this moment so vulnerable, so unprepared, we must examine the decades between Belgrade's fall in 1521 and the catastrophic battle that would follow. It is a story not just of military missteps, but of politics, pride, and the quiet erosion of institutional strength. The fall of Belgrade, a warning ignored. When Belgrade fell to the Ottomans in 1521, the news reverberated through Hungary like a funeral bell. The fortress that had once withstood the might of maimed II had been lost in a matter of weeks. It was a wake-up call for a kingdom already staggering from internal problems. But unlike in 1456, there was no John Hunniadi to rally the troops, no Matthias Corvinus to centralize authority. Instead, the crown rested on the head of a teenage king, Louis II, who had inherited the throne at the age of 10. Though well-intentioned, Louis was politically inexperienced and deeply constrained by Hungary's fractious nobility. Worse, his court was dominated by rival factions, each more interested in preserving personal privilege than securing the kingdom's defense. The weakness of the Diet and nobility. The Hungarian Diet parliament had become a battlefield of noble self-interest. Every tax increase was resisted. Military reforms were blocked. Nobles refused to pay for the fortresses they depended on, insisting that local communities or the crown foot the bill. The rise of magnate politics meant that powerful aristocratic families like the Zapolia and Bathory clans operated semi-independently, ruling their domains like miniature kingdoms. Troop levies were delayed. Fortifications were neglected. In some cases, nobles hoarded funds intended for frontier defense. This fragmentation was not merely administrative, it was psychological. Many lords refused to believe the Ottomans would risk a full-scale invasion. Others assumed that, if the Ottomans came, the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor would ride to the rescue. But neither the papacy nor Emperor Charles V, then preoccupied with wars in Italy and against Protestant reformers, could or would commit substantial forces. Hungary in the end stood alone. The rise of Suleiman the Magnificent. Meanwhile, across the Danube, the Ottoman Empire had entered its golden age under Sultan Suleiman I, later called the Magnificent in Europe and the lawgiver in the Islamic world. Suleiman was everything Hungary feared: intelligent, ambitious, and relentless. By the early 1520s, he had already secured his eastern borders, reformed his army, and overseen massive investments in military logistics. His supply chains could feed armies over hundreds of miles. His janissaries were now armed with muskets and disciplined in volley fire. And most critically, his commanders were experienced veterans of Balkan and Persian campaigns. In 1526, Suleiman gathered his forces and turned once again toward Hungary. Mobilization without unity. When word of the impending invasion reached Buda, panic ensued. King Louis II called for a general mobilization of the nobility, as was customary, but responses were delayed. Many nobles sent only token forces. Others stayed home, citing harvest season, illness, or political grievances. Louis, barely 20, struggled to unify his commanders. His advisors were divided between pro-Habsburg and pro-Zapolia factions, and despite warnings from foreign envoys, few believed that Suleiman would press deeply into Hungary that year. It was late summer. The Danube was high. The roads were difficult. Surely, they reasoned, the Ottomans would delay. They were wrong. The march of the Ottoman army. Suleiman's army estimates range from 50,000 to over 100,000 marched with precision. It included janissaries, cavalry, engineers, and a massive artillery train. Along the way, the Ottomans repaired bridges, laid temporary roads, and maintained tight discipline. Local populations often fled before them, leaving scorched villages in their wake. Yet the campaign was not merely destruction. Ottoman scribes recorded towns captured, supplies stored, and garrisons installed. This was no raiding party. It was an invasion army. By mid-August, Suleiman had crossed the Sava River. His scouts skirmished with Hungarian advance forces. Aware that the capital could soon be threatened, Louis decided to make a stand at a flat stretch of land near Mohacs, along the Danube's floodplain. It was a disastrous choice. The field of Mohacs. The terrain at Mohacs offered little advantage. The plain was open and wide, ideal for Ottoman cavalry and artillery. The Hungarian army, perhaps 25,000 to 30,000 strong, was composed mostly of nobles and their retinues. They were brave but poorly coordinated, and lacked the professional infantry and artillery support needed for modern warfare. Louis hoped to surprise the Ottomans with a sudden attack before their full forces arrived. He arranged his troops into a single line, with cavalry on the flanks and cannon in the center. But the Ottomans were prepared. They used feigned retreats, drew Hungarian forces into traps, and then unleashed disciplined volleys of musket and artillery fire. Janissaries advanced behind shields and dug field trenches. Within 2 hours, the Hungarian line collapsed. A kingdom shattered. King Louis II died while fleeing the battlefield. His body was later found drowned in a marsh. Nearly all of Hungary's high-ranking nobility perished. The political leadership of the kingdom was decapitated in a single afternoon. The Ottomans did not press on to Buda immediately. Instead, Suleiman allowed his forces to loot the battlefield and then withdrew for the season. But the damage was done. Mohacs was not just a military defeat, it was a civilizational blow. The myth of Hungarian invincibility had been shattered. The kingdom was leaderless, divided, and vulnerable. The aftermath, division and decline. In the chaos that followed, rival factions scrambled for control. One group elected John Zapolya, a powerful noble, as king. Another supported Ferdinand of Habsburg, brother of Emperor Charles V. Civil war erupted. The kingdom was split, and as the two sides fought, the Ottomans exploited the division. By 1541, Ottoman forces occupied Buda itself. Hungary ceased to exist as a unified state. It was divided into 3 parts. Ottoman Hungary, the central and most fertile region, ruled directly by Istanbul. Royal Hungary, the western and northern areas, held by the Habsburgs. Transylvania, a semi-independent principality, often caught between both powers. This tripartite division would define the region for the next 150 years. A bleeding frontier. The long war for Central Europe had entered a darker phase. With Hungary fractured, the Ottoman frontier extended deep into the continent. From newly built forts at Szeged, Buda, and Pécs, Ottoman governors taxed, conscripted, and policed Hungarian lands. The local population adapted, some fled, others converted, some resisted quietly. Border zones became zones of liminality, where cultures overlapped and identities were fluid. The Danube, once a symbol of unity and trade, had become a frontier of empire and faith. And yet, resistance simmered. Outlaws known as Hajdu harassed Ottoman convoys. Christian uprisings flared in rural areas. Habsburg forces planned campaigns to retake lost territories. But for the average Hungarian peasant, life had become a cycle of uncertainty. Shifting allegiances, heavy taxes, and the constant threat of conscription or flight. The shadow of Mohacs. To this day, the term Mohacs in Hungarian remains a symbol of disaster more than a battlefield. It became a cultural scar. It marked the moment when Hungary lost not just a war, but its sovereignty, its cohesion, and its place as a major European power. The long war was not over. It would continue for generations. But after Mohacs, Hungary would never again fight as a unified kingdom. And then, how did Hungary survive as a divided land between empires? What happened in Transylvania, once a Hungarian heartland, now a buffer state? And how did the people living in the Ottoman-ruled plains adapt, resist, or endure the long occupation? The battlefield at Mohacs had fallen silent, but its echoes carried for centuries. Hungary, once a proud and expansive kingdom, lay in fragments, its political structure shattered, its aristocracy decimated, and its population scattered across three rival entities. Yet Hungary did not vanish. Its people, its culture, and its memory endured through siege, famine, and foreign rule. The Ottomans might hold the land, but they could not erase the will of those who remained upon it. This is the story not of great battles, but of long occupation, slow resistance, and quiet survival. It is, in every sense, the essence of a long war. The three-part kingdom. After 1541, Hungary's division became formalized. Central Hungary, including the capital, Buda, was ruled directly by the Ottoman Empire as a vilayet, or province. This was the agricultural heartland, with fertile plains, important rivers, and rich towns, all now under Istanbul's control. Royal Hungary, primarily the western and northern regions, modern Slovakia and parts of western Hungary, came under the rule of the Habsburg monarchy, centered in Vienna. Though nominally free, it was tightly controlled by the Austrian crown. Transylvania, formerly part of the Hungarian crown, became a semi-autonomous principality. Governed by local rulers but under Ottoman suzerainty, it walked a tightrope between submission and independence. Each region developed differently culturally, politically, and economically, but all carried the scars of the long war. Ottoman Hungary, rule through administration. In Ottoman-controlled Hungary, governance was practical, not punitive. The Ottomans introduced their provincial system, dividing the region into sanjaks under governors known as beys or pashas. The aim was not cultural conversion but efficient taxation and military stability. Many towns retained some autonomy. Local Christians were allowed to practice their religion under the millet system, in which each religious group managed its own civil affairs. Orthodox Christians fared slightly better than Catholics, whom the Ottomans viewed as politically suspect due to their ties to Vienna and Rome. Mosques and baths appeared in once Christian towns. Churches were converted or left to decay. Hungarian was still spoken, but Turkish words entered the lexicon. The minaret joined the steeple on the skyline. Daily life, however, was more defined by taxes than faith. Peasants paid jizya, a tax on non-Muslims, tithes on crops, and in some cases were conscripted for local service or labor. In return, the Ottomans maintained basic security and trade routes. The bureaucracy was efficient. Corruption, though present, was often punished. Ottoman law was enforced in courtrooms where scribes documented transactions in a mix of Arabic, Turkish, and Latin. Yet the occupation came with a cost. Raids into Habsburg lands were frequent. Border violence remained endemic. And for many Hungarians, particularly nobles and clergy, Ottoman rule was a humiliation. Royal Hungary, faith, fortresses, and frustration. Under the Habsburgs, Royal Hungary became both a haven and a powder keg. It was heavily militarized, serving as the front line in the empire's long struggle against the Ottomans. Fortresses were built and rebuilt across the region. Komárom, Győr, and Pressburg, modern Bratislava, became key garrison towns. The military frontier was fortified with professional soldiers, mercenaries, and peasant conscripts. Catholicism was promoted aggressively. Protestantism, which had spread rapidly in Hungary during the Reformation, was often suppressed by the Habsburgs, who feared religious dissent as a prelude to political rebellion. This dual pressure from Vienna on one side and Istanbul on the other left many Hungarians alienated. Nobles resented the loss of independence. Peasants were taxed heavily to fund wars they neither chose nor benefited from. Still, Royal Hungary became a cultural bastion. Hungarian scholars found patronage in Habsburg courts. Jesuit colleges trained a new generation of administrators. A new hybrid identity emerged, Hungarian in language and memory, but increasingly influenced by Austrian customs and centralized rule. Transylvania, a buffer with ambition. Transylvania, meanwhile, carved out a delicate niche. Though technically under Ottoman overlordship, it was governed by Hungarian princes who maintained a remarkable degree of independence. These rulers paid annual tribute to the Sultan, but in return, they were allowed to administer their own affairs. Transylvania became a beacon of religious tolerance, unusual in 16th century Europe. Lutheranism, Calvinism, Catholicism, and Eastern Orthodoxy were all recognized by law. The Edict of Torda, 1568, stands out as one of the earliest legal guarantees of religious freedom in Europe. Its capital, Julafeavar, Alba Iulia, became a center of learning. Printing presses flourished. Hungarian language texts circulated. Princes like Gabor Bethlen later promoted education, diplomacy, and even modernization efforts. But Transylvania was always at risk. Habsburg agents stirred rebellion. Ottoman demands grew heavier. Local factions vied for power. The principality was both a refuge and a pawn in a larger geopolitical chess game. Life amid occupation. While empires clashed, ordinary life persisted in the margins. Villages were rebuilt after raids. Fields were replanted. Trade resumed where possible, especially across informal border markets where Hungarian, Turkish, and German merchants exchanged goods. Borderland communities developed a strange duality. Some villages paid taxes to both the Ottomans and Habsburgs, depending on which army last passed through. Others turned to outlaw bands, the Hajdu, Kuruk, or Serb Martelos for protection or vengeance. These semi-military groups, part rebel, part mercenary, often shifted allegiances. Their leaders could become folk heroes or feared bandits. Many were veterans or dispossessed peasants. They raided supply lines, burned enemy outposts, and sometimes served as irregular border troops under either empire. Cultural life persisted, though altered. Folk songs told of lost kings, burning villages, and brave resistance. Oral storytelling became essential, preserving memory in the absence of safety or permanence. The psychological frontier. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Ottoman occupation was psychological. Hungarians developed what historians call a siege mentality, a collective memory of betrayal, resistance, and endurance. The trauma of division, occupation, and foreign rule was encoded in folk tales, chronicles, and church sermons. Even in peaceful times, the border was never truly safe. The constant threat of raids, conscription, or forced migration created a culture of vigilance. Church towers doubled as watch posts. Entire villages were designed to be defensible. A child born in southern Hungary in the late 1500s might live their entire life without seeing a year without soldiers passing through. Survival, more than loyalty or patriotism, became the guiding principle. And yet there was resilience. Local leaders learned to negotiate. Communities built alliances. Some even prospered in the margins, taking advantage of trade between empires. A glimpse toward liberation. By the late 17th century, the tide began to turn. The Ottoman Empire, stretched by wars with Persia and internal unrest, began to lose its grip on Hungary. A new Habsburg campaign, combined with Polish and German allies, slowly pushed south. In 1686, Buda was retaken by Christian forces after a long siege. The recapture of the city was hailed as a turning point. Yet even this victory came with devastation. Plague, starvation, and reprisals marked the path of liberation. It would take decades more before the Ottomans were fully expelled from Hungarian lands. But from the ashes of occupation, a new Hungarian identity was already forming, one shaped not by unity, but by survival across division. Legacy of the Long War. The long Ottoman-Hungarian struggle, from the fall of Belgrade to the reconquest of Buda, was not just a military episode, it was a civilizational crucible. It forged a people hardened by siege and sorrow. It left behind ruined towns, repopulated cities, and folk songs filled with memory. It embedded a deep distrust of empires both east and west, and a yearning for sovereignty that would echo into the 19th and 20th centuries. Even today, the echoes of that era are felt. The phrase "more than Mohawks" is still used to describe great loss. Old fortresses now host festivals. Minarets and church spires still share the sky in cities like Paix and Eger. The past was never truly buried, only layered. Final reflection. Hungary's long war on the frontier was not a single conflict, it was a generational trial of endurance. It was a lesson in how a nation can fracture, suffer, and yet somehow continue. In every ruined church, every watchtower, and every border village, the memory of that struggle lingers not as an epic of glory, but as a quiet tale of persistence. What then does it mean for a nation to be both a wall and a crossroads? And what can modern Europe learn from a people who survived between two worlds for so long? Story 3. The Siege of Vienna, 1529. Ottoman ambitions at Europe's doorstep. You are standing beneath gray skies, just outside the thick walls of Vienna in the autumn of 1529. Rain soaks the earth. Wind whips through unfinished trenches. Ottoman cannons lie waterlogged in the mud. On the horizon, the massive army of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent surrounds the city like a tightening noose. Inside the gates, a mixture of trained soldiers, townspeople, and farmers prepare for what may be the fall of yet another European stronghold. It is not Constantinople, but for many it feels eerily close. This is the first great test of whether Christian Europe can resist the full might of the Ottoman Empire on its own soil. The Habsburg capital is not just a city, it is a symbol. And now, it is under siege. After Mohawks, the power vacuum. Following the catastrophic Hungarian defeat at Mohawks in 1526, much of Central Europe was left reeling. Hungary, which had long served as the buffer between the Ottoman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, had collapsed into civil war. Two rival kings, John Zapolya and Ferdinand of Habsburg, competed for the throne, each claiming legitimacy, each seeking foreign support. Suleiman had supported Zapolya, seeing him as a pliable vassal who could keep Hungary divided and under Ottoman influence. But Ferdinand, brother of Emperor Charles V and a Habsburg prince with ambitions, pressed westward from royal Hungary. In 1527 and 1528, he launched a series of campaigns, capturing key Hungarian towns and challenging Ottoman claims. Suleiman viewed Ferdinand's advances not only as betrayal, but as provocation. He would not tolerate encroachment so close to his sphere of influence. So in the spring of 1529, the Sultan launched a massive campaign with a singular aim: to break the Habsburg hold on Central Europe and perhaps, just perhaps, take Vienna itself. The March of the Sultan. The Ottoman army assembled in Edirne, Adrianople, in the early months of 1529. It was a logistical marvel: tens of thousands of janissaries, Sipahi cavalry, auxiliary troops, engineers, and support personnel. Some estimates suggest over 100,000 men, though practical deployment figures were likely lower. Artillery was loaded heavy guns that had broken through the walls of Belgrade and other fortresses. Supplies were packed. Engineers planned routes through the Balkans. Suleiman himself led the march, a rare and symbolic move. When the Sultan rode with his army, it signaled a campaign of great significance. By summer, the Ottoman host was moving through Serbia and Hungary, taking back towns Ferdinand had captured and reinstalling Zapolya as a puppet king. The speed and scale of the advance unnerved European observers. Cities surrendered without a fight. Nobles fled westward. The road to Vienna was open. The state of Vienna. Vienna in 1529 was not yet the grand imperial city it would become. It was a fortified but modest urban center on the banks of the Danube. Its defenses were formidable but aging thick stone walls, some wooden ramparts, and a number of towers. It had no moat. The outer suburbs had been hastily destroyed to deny the Ottomans cover. Inside the city were perhaps 18,000 people, including about 8,000 troops under Count Nicholas von Salm, an aging but experienced military commander. He was supported by Wilhelm von Roggendorf, an Austrian general who had fought in Italy. Reinforcements were few and scattered. Ferdinand, realizing the gravity of the threat, had retreated west. Charles V, distracted by wars in France and religious conflict within the empire, could not send aid in time. So Vienna would stand alone. Suleiman arrives. In mid-September 1529, the Ottoman army reached the outskirts of Vienna. The long march, however, had taken a toll. Torrential rains had slowed progress. Supply lines were stretched thin. Many of the heavy cannons had been lost in the mud or left behind. Still, the Ottoman presence was overwhelming. Camps spread for miles. Tents were raised in neat rows. Janissaries drilled in formation. For the defenders on Vienna's walls, it was a terrifying sight. A sea of soldiers in white turbans and bright sashes, their banners fluttering with Arabic calligraphy. Suleiman sent envoys demanding surrender. The offer was refused. Preparing for sea, Suleiman ordered the city encircled. His engineers began digging sapping tunnels under the walls, an attempt to detonate charges beneath the foundations. Trenches were dug. Positions for cannons were prepared, though only medium-sized artillery could be used. The Ottomans lacked the heavy guns that had once toppled Constantinople. The defenders, meanwhile, worked day and night to reinforce the city's weakest points. Women and children helped move earth. Churches served as supply depots. Makeshift hospitals were created in monasteries. Count von Salm organized rotating shifts to keep the walls manned at all times. Cannons from the city's arsenal were positioned along the ramparts. Crossbowmen, arquebusiers, and even militia volunteers were drilled into service. Everyone knew what was at stake. The battle begins. On September 27, the siege began in earnest. Ottoman cannons fired upon the walls. Sappers worked beneath them. Infantry launched probing attacks, testing the defenders' response. Tunnels were dug, and charges set, but time and again, defenders found them and collapsed them before they could do damage. The Janissaries, elite infantry of the Ottoman army, launched multiple assaults, especially at the Kärntner Gate, one of the city's most vulnerable spots. They were met with fierce resistance. Vienna's defenders used boiling oil, grenades, pikes, and musket fire. They repaired breaches overnight and used debris to block holes in the walls. Rain continued to pour. Mud clogged the trenches. Food began to run low on both sides. Disease spread in the Ottoman camp. The Austrians, though under siege, were slightly better supplied thanks to local granaries and civilian stockpiles. Still, every day brought new attacks. Suleiman's dilemma. Suleiman faced a harsh reality. His army was not equipped for a long siege. The rainy season had arrived early. His artillery was insufficient to breach the walls. His supply lines were stretched. Morale was slipping. He ordered one final, massive assault in mid-October. Janissaries stormed the walls in coordinated waves. Drums beat. Banners waved. For hours, the defenders fought desperately, repelling attack after attack. At one point, some Ottoman forces reached the inner walls but were pushed back by a countercharge led by Salm himself. The city held. Retreat and aftermath. On October 15, Suleiman made the decision to retreat. The weather had worsened. Snow fell early that year. His men were exhausted and casualties were mounting. The great siege of Vienna had failed. The withdrawal was orderly but painful. Ottoman forces burned villages as they retreated. The Sultan left behind a symbolic message. Vienna had survived, but it would remain in his sights. In Vienna, the bells rang. A city had withstood the most powerful empire in the world. Count von Salm, hailed as a hero, would die from injuries sustained during the siege. His grave remains in Vienna to this day. The importance of the 1529 siege. Though less famous than the later siege of 1683, the Siege of Vienna in 1529 was a pivotal moment in European history. It marked the high-water mark of early Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. It also signaled the beginning of a new kind of conflict, a long, grinding war between the Habsburgs and Ottomans that would last for over 150 years. This siege was not just about armies or walls. It was about the contest between two civilizations, one Christian, one Muslim, each claiming to be the rightful heir to Rome, each seeking to dominate the same contested heartland. And then, how did Europe respond to this close call? Did it unite to resist further Ottoman invasions, or did it continue to fracture along religious lines? And what did Suleiman learn from this failure, and how would he change his strategy in the campaigns that followed? The autumn mud still clung to Vienna's walls as the Ottoman army vanished into the cold mist of retreat. The cannon smoke cleared, the trenches collapsed, but the memory of Suleiman's great siege remained burned into Europe's consciousness. Vienna had stood, but even in victory, the city was shaken, and so too was Europe. The 1529 siege had proven what few rulers in the West had been willing to admit. The Ottoman Empire was not only a serious military power, it was willing and capable of striking deep into the Christian heartlands. Now the question remained, would Europe respond as one, or would it yet again allow division, ego, and religion to blunt its defense? A symbolic victory, a strategic stalemate. From a military perspective, the Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1529 failed. The city did not fall. Suleiman did not install his chosen king, John Zappalya, in a triumphant parade. No Ottoman banners flew from the Hofburg Palace. But from another angle, the campaign had been a success. It reasserted Ottoman dominance over central Hungary. It humiliated the Habsburgs, who had lost most of their gains from earlier campaigns. It sent a message to the Christian world: nowhere was out of reach. Suleiman returned to Constantinople without conquest, but not without prestige. He had campaigned on foreign soil, pushed the Habsburgs back, and demonstrated his empire's logistical strength. He also learned valuable lessons about siege warfare in Europe, lessons that would shape his future plans. John Zappalya and the Shadow Kingdom. In the aftermath, John Zappalya, Suleiman's puppet claimant to the Hungarian throne, was reinstalled in parts of eastern Hungary and Transylvania. He ruled with Ottoman backing, nominally as King of Hungary, though his legitimacy was fiercely contested. Zappalya became a symbol of divided loyalties. To some, he was a traitor and enabler of Ottoman aggression. To others, he was a realist, preserving a semblance of Hungarian rule under impossible circumstances. His court operated under the constant threat of Habsburg invasion and Ottoman oversight. Taxes were collected in ducats and tributes sent east. Mosques were built in border towns. Hungarian soldiers served under Ottoman banners. And in quiet rooms, Zappalya negotiated with both Vienna and Constantinople, attempting to play both sides. This precarious balance became the new normal in Hungary, a kingdom no longer sovereign, but not entirely conquered either. Ferdinand's response and Habsburg frustration. Ferdinand of Habsburg, whose capital had just narrowly escaped conquest, did not forget. He began investing heavily in fortress construction, especially along the Danube and in Royal Hungary. The towns of Pressburg, Bratislava, Győr, and Komárom became focal points of new defensive strategies. The military frontier system, or Grenzfestungen, was expanded. Garrisons were stationed year-round. Fortifications were improved with bastions, gunports, and angled walls suited to resisting artillery. Civilian towns became fortified enclaves, part home, part garrison. But Ferdinand's reach was limited. His brother, Emperor Charles V, was embroiled in conflicts with France and the Protestant Reformation. The Habsburgs could not concentrate fully on the Ottoman front. Troop levies were inconsistent, funding was slow, and the empire's patchwork nature dozens of semi-autonomous duchies and bishoprics made coordination painfully slow. Ferdinand knew that without a centralized defense and strong alliances, the Ottomans would return. The Protestant Reformation and the problem of unity. Perhaps the greatest obstacle to a united European response was not military, it was religious. In 1517, Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. By the 1520s, the Reformation had spread rapidly through Germany, Switzerland, and parts of Scandinavia. Princes declared their independence from Rome. Peasants revolted in the name of reform. Religious war loomed across the Holy Roman Empire. This internal division devastated any hope of a pan-Christian alliance against the Ottomans. Catholic and Protestant states were more likely to see each other as enemies than to coordinate defense against a distant Muslim empire. Ironically, Suleiman followed these developments closely. Ottoman diplomats understood that a fragmented Europe was a distracted Europe. Ottoman policy was to encourage such divisions wherever possible, sometimes even suggesting alliances with Protestant princes to weaken Habsburg control. As Europe argued over transubstantiation, Suleiman built roads and raised armies. The Ottoman Empire, strategic patience and planning. Despite the retreat in 1529, Suleiman did not consider Vienna a lost cause. His planners reviewed the campaign's failures. Logistics. The roads had become impassable in the autumn rains. Future campaigns would need better seasonal timing and more local supply caches. Artillery. The loss of heavy siege cannons en route had crippled the offensive. Improvements in mobile artillery would follow. Fortifications. Vienna's defenses, though old, had proven effective. Future sieges would require more sustained and coordinated engineering. Back in Constantinople, the Ottomans shifted to a strategy of consolidation and indirect pressure. Rather than return immediately to Vienna, they focused on strengthening control of Hungary through Zapolia, building infrastructure in the Balkans, harassing Habsburg supply lines and outposts, supporting uprisings and instability in Christian territories. This slower, more methodical approach kept the Habsburgs off balance and allowed the Ottomans to maintain pressure without risking another high-profile failure. The human toll in the borderlands. While rulers strategized, the war continued in quieter, more brutal ways along the frontier. Raids were frequent. Ottoman Akinci cavalry swept through unguarded towns, taking slaves, livestock, and valuables. In return, Christian irregulars and mercenaries known as Hajdus or Uskoks launched reprisal raids into Ottoman lands. Civilians suffered most. Villages were burned and rebuilt. Men were conscripted or kidnapped. Children grew up not knowing whether the flag over their town would be the Habsburg eagle or the Ottoman crescent. In some cases, both taxes were demanded depending on who last passed through. Fortress towns swelled with refugees, straining resources. In these urban strongholds, life took on a rhythm shaped by war. Blacksmiths made cannonballs as often as horseshoes. Churches doubled as garrisons. Weddings and funerals were often interrupted by the distant sound of drums. For many, survival meant compromise. Some local nobles made secret agreements with Ottoman commanders. Others joined resistance groups. A few converted or sent their children to serve in foreign courts for safety. This was not a clean clash of empires. It was a long, gray twilight of survival. The myth of unity, the reality of isolation. The siege of Vienna in 1529 had prompted calls across Europe for renewed crusading spirit. Sermons were preached, funds were raised, treatises were written. But little came of it. France, ever the Habsburg rival, later allied with the Ottomans in a shocking diplomatic shift. The Franco-Ottoman alliance became one of the most pragmatic and unsettling realities of the 16th century. Faith, it seemed, was no longer enough to define alliances. England, focused on dynastic drama and religious reform, remained distant. The Italian states were divided. The Holy Roman Empire remained more holy than empire, a patchwork of fractious loyalties. Vienna had survived, but it stood alone. And even as Suleiman delayed his return, everyone understood this was not the end. It was only an intermission. And then, the year is 1532. Word spreads across Europe once more. The Ottomans are on the march again. But where are they headed this time? What fortress will fall or hold? And can Vienna survive a second great siege, or will the next attempt finally crack its defenses? It is the summer of 1532. 10,000 soldiers stand watch behind hastily constructed walls in the small Austrian town of Koseg. They listen for the sound of hooves, the thunder of cannon wheels rolling down mountain roads, and the cries of yet another Ottoman host marching into the heart of Europe. But this is not Vienna. This is the edge of the empire, a small, unknown place in the grand scheme of war. And yet, for a second time, Suleiman the Magnificent is bringing the full force of the Ottoman Empire westward. The target, still unclear, but the message is unmistakable. The struggle between East and West is far from over. The march westward again. After the failed siege of Vienna in 1529, Sultan Suleiman did not abandon his European ambitions. The Habsburgs had refused to withdraw from contested Hungarian territories, and their support for rival claimants to the Hungarian crown infuriated the Ottoman court. In 1532, Suleiman once more gathered an army, one even larger and more prepared than before. Estimates vary widely, but most place his force between 100,000 and 120,000 men, including janissaries, artillery, cavalry, and support personnel. This time, he brought heavier siege guns, more engineers, and expanded supply chains. Yet as the army moved north through the Balkans and into western Hungary, something strange occurred. Vienna was bypassed. Instead, the army turned slightly westward and advanced toward Koseg, a small frontier town with fewer than 1,000 defenders. Why? Historians debate this. Some suggest Suleiman had intelligence that Vienna had been reinforced and was better defended. Others believe the Ottomans hoped to lure Habsburg forces into battle on open ground, rather than risk another siege. Still others see it as a probe, a way to demonstrate power, test defenses, and assert dominance. Regardless of the reason, what followed was one of the most unexpected episodes in Ottoman Habsburg history. The Siege of Koseg, a minor fortress, a major symbol. Koseg, located near the Austrian border, had little strategic importance. But its commander, Nicholas Jurizic, a Croatian noble in Habsburg service, refused to surrender. With a garrison of around 700–800 soldiers, including civilians and irregulars, Jurizic faced an enemy that outnumbered him more than 100 to 1. Still, the walls were manned, artillery was fired, messengers were sent to request reinforcements, and for over 25 days Koseg resisted. Each day the defenders patched breaches, salvaged supplies, and prayed. Ottoman sappers undermined the walls. Bombardments raged. Offers of surrender were made and rejected. It was a display of willpower more than strength. Suleiman grew frustrated. Rain and supply issues again slowed the campaign. And now, Charles V and Ferdinand were finally mobilizing a substantial army to the north, preparing to meet the Ottomans in battle if they advanced. Rather than press on, the Sultan withdrew. Koseg held. It was a minor tactical episode, but a major psychological moment. A tiny garrison had resisted the might of an empire. Vienna breathed easier, again spared destruction. Diplomatic endings, uneasy peace. Shortly after the 1532 campaign, negotiations began. Both the Ottomans and the Habsburgs recognized the limits of immediate conquest. In 1533, the Treaty of Constantinople was signed. Ferdinand renounced his claim to most of Hungary, recognizing Ottoman suzerainty over the region. In return, Suleiman recognized Ferdinand as the ruler of Royal Hungary, the western territories still under Habsburg control. This was not a peace born of trust, it was an agreement based on exhaustion. Both empires were stretched. Rebellion, cost, and logistics all pointed to a need for temporary calm. But the frontier remained hot. Local conflicts, raids, and sieges continued. The long war had only paused, it had not ended. Vienna transformed. The experiences of 1529 and 1532 changed Vienna forever. Once a modest city on the Danube, Vienna began its transformation into the military and administrative heart of the Habsburg Empire. Massive investments were poured into its defenses. The medieval walls were reinforced, moats were deepened, bastions were added, forming a star-shaped ring around the old city. A standing garrison became permanent. Armories were stocked with gunpowder and cannon. The Hofburg Palace expanded not just as a royal residence, but as a symbol of defiance. Vienna also became a symbol in Christian Europe, a kind of Eastern bulwark, similar to what Hungary had once been. Art and literature cast it as the guardian of Christendom. Pilgrimages were made to the churches that had withstood the siege. The memory of 1529 was kept alive, not only as a victory but as a warning. They had come once, they would come again. Cultural and psychological impacts. Across Europe, the repeated Ottoman invasions sparked renewed interest in understanding the enemy. Books were written about Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, and Ottoman governance. Some were scholarly, others were steeped in fear and propaganda. Suleiman was both demonized and grudgingly admired. His title, the Magnificent, was used with a mix of awe and anxiety. Maps began to include more detail of the Ottoman world. Trade with the empire, paradoxically, continued and even expanded. Venetian merchants moved easily between Christian and Muslim ports. Ottoman textiles, ceramics, and coffee found their way into European markets. But for the average European, the image of the Turk at the gates was deeply embedded. It became a rallying cry for sermons, taxes, and recruitment. For border communities, it was not propaganda, it was lived experience. The Ottoman shift in strategy. Having failed to take Vienna, Suleiman and his successors turned their attention elsewhere in the short term. Naval power in the Mediterranean expanded, especially under admirals like Hayreddin Barbarossa. The Siege of Malta, 1565, and other campaigns in North Africa and the Levant diverted attention from the Habsburgs for a time. In the Balkans, the Ottomans consolidated their administrative hold, building roads, enforcing tax systems, and integrating local elites. The 16th century became a period of entrenched rivalry rather than outright conquest. The front remained in flux. Fortresses changed hands. Treaties were made and broken. But no major offensive against Vienna occurred again, not for over 150 years. Jurisic's Psalm and the memory of resistance. The defenders of 1529 and 1532 became legends. Count Nicholas von Salm, who had led the defense of Vienna in 1529, was buried with honors, his tomb still visible today in the city's cathedrals. Nicholas Jurisic's, hero of Koseg, was celebrated in songs and chronicles. His name became synonymous with courage in the face of hopeless odds. And yet, both men represent more than just heroism, they symbolize a broader story. How European powers, even when fractured, could resist. Their victories were not achieved through overwhelming strength, but through resolve, preparation, and timing. Toward the Great Siege of 1683. While 1529 did not mark the end of Ottoman ambitions in Europe, it created a precedent. Vienna had been targeted once and survived. The fear remained. So did the watchfulness. Over the next century and a half, that watchfulness became tradition. By 1683, the Ottoman Empire would return, this time under Kara Mustafa Pasha, in what would become the Second Siege of Vienna, one of the most decisive battles in early modern European history. But that is a later chapter. The first siege in 1529 remains a point when the line between East and West was drawn in mud, blood, and prayer. Final reflection. The 1529 siege of Vienna was not the dramatic clash of civilizations so often imagined. It was, in many ways, a logistical failure, a campaign that fell apart under the weight of terrain and weather. But its consequences were real and long-lasting. It exposed the vulnerabilities of Christian Europe. It galvanized defenses. It created enduring myths. And it marked the start of a 150-year contest between two of history's most powerful empires. What can we learn from a siege that didn't succeed but changed everything? And when the Ottomans returned in 1683, would the lessons of 1529 still hold? Story 4. Children of War, Architects of Empire. You are walking through the shadowed halls of Topkapi Palace in 15th century Istanbul. The scent of burning incense lingers in the air. Outside, drums echo in the distance. An elite procession is forming in the courtyard. They wear no armor, but they are feared more than any cavalry or noble-born warrior. They are the Sultan's elite, the Janissaries, the iron backbone of the Ottoman military machine. But these soldiers were not born into privilege. They were not Ottoman by blood, nor Muslim by birth. They were taken. This is the story of how the Janissaries, Europe's first standing army, were forged from captives, molded through rigorous discipline, and became the architects of Ottoman expansion. The origins, building a new kind of army. In the late 14th century, as the Ottoman state began transforming into a true empire, its leaders realized that traditional military models would not be enough. The feudal system where cavalry were drawn from landholding nobles, the Sipahi, worked for smaller conflicts, but it was unreliable. Loyalty was split. Mobilization was slow. The Ottomans needed something more disciplined, more central, more directly loyal to the Sultan himself. So they created something new. They called it the Kapikulu Akagi, the Sultan's household troops. Its core would be the Janissaries, or Yenissary in Turkish, meaning new soldiers. But what made them truly different was not their uniforms or tactics. It was how they were recruited. The Devshirme system, taxing in children. At the heart of the Janissary Corps was a policy both feared and quietly admired. The Devshirme, literally, the collection. Under this system, Ottoman authorities took Christian boys from their families in the Balkans every few years. Typically aged 8 to 14, the boys were selected from villages in modern-day Albania, Bosnia, Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria. The process was justified as a kind of tax in blood in lieu of money or grain. The empire took children. The boys were chosen based on appearance, intelligence, and health. Only the strongest were taken. The rest were left behind. To the Ottomans, it was a recruitment mechanism. To the villagers, it was trauma. Mothers hid their children. Priests protested. Entire villages fled to avoid the Devshirme levy. But in time, a strange transformation occurred. The children became elite. From Christian boys to Muslim soldiers. After selection, the boys were marched to Istanbul or other training centers. There, they were forcibly converted to Islam. They were given Turkish names. Their previous identities were erased. And then they began their new lives. Some were sent to Anatolian farms for years, living with Turkish families to learn the language and customs. Others were placed directly into military training schools. The goal was to forge loyalty not to family or village or church, but to the Sultan alone. The training was harsh. Physical conditioning, daily drills, wrestling, archery, and horsemanship. Academic instruction, Arabic, Turkish, Islamic theology, and court etiquette. Mental discipline, obedience, silence, and the suppression of individual will. The Janissary Creed emphasized brotherhood, order, and humility. They lived in barracks, slept in shared quarters, and were forbidden from marrying or owning personal property. They were taught that the Sultan was their father, the core their family, and Islam their path. The Janissary uniform and identity. By the 15th century, the Janissaries had become a distinct and recognizable force. Their uniforms were simple but symbolic: a long white tunic, a red sash, and a tall felt cap with a unique trailing cloth down the back, the burq. This headdress marked their status and distinguished them on the battlefield. They carried matchlock muskets, making them one of the first units in Europe to adopt firearms as standard. Over time, they were equipped with sabers, pistols, and grenades. In formation, they marched in silence. Their drummers and mater bands, military musicians, signaled commands through rhythms and melodies. In battle, their chants and coordinated volleys sowed fear. They were not many, often numbering between 10,000 and 15,000 at their height in the 15th and 16th centuries, but their impact was outsized. Battlefield success and the expansion of empire. The Janissaries were at the heart of almost every major Ottoman victory. At the Battle of Varna, 1444, they held the line against a combined Polish-Hungarian crusading army, turning the tide of the fight. At the fall of Constantinople, 1453, they were the first over the walls after days of pounding artillery fire. At Mohacs, 1526, they delivered crushing volleys against disorganized Hungarian nobles, sealing one of the most lopsided defeats in European history. At Vienna, 1529, they launched relentless assaults on the city's walls, coming closer to breaking through than any other Ottoman unit. Their discipline, willingness to die, and cohesion under fire made them a revolutionary force. No longer did battles depend solely on noble cavalry charges or untrained levies. The Janissaries represented a new way of war, professional, state-directed, and relentless. They were Europe's first standing army in a time when most Christian states still relied on seasonal levies and mercenaries. Janissary privileges and internal prestige. Despite their origins as enslaved boys, Janissaries enjoyed immense privileges as adults. They were paid regular salaries, rare in a pre-modern world. They received bonuses after campaigns and stipend upon retirement. They were exempt from taxes. They had their own courts, traditions, and governing body, the Janissary Agha, their commander. Over time, some Janissaries rose to incredible heights. A few became viziers, governors, or even grand viziers, the equivalent of prime ministers. Their loyalty to the Sultan was not just military, it was political. Ironically, many Christian families eventually sought the devshirm for their sons. The stigma faded as success stories spread. In some cases, bribes were paid to ensure selection. What had once been seen as a curse had, for some, become a pathway to power. Discipline and control. But the system required constant control. Janissaries were forbidden to marry, engage in trade, live outside the barracks, form family dynasties. These rules were designed to prevent the rise of an independent military aristocracy. Yet as the empire grew, the system began to strain. Corruption entered the recruitment process. Some Janissaries married in secret. Others used their status to amass wealth or influence. The strict discipline that had once defined the core began to loosen. By the late 16th century, these cracks would widen, but in the 15th and early 16th centuries, the Janissaries remained the most effective fighting force in the Ottoman arsenal. Fear and fascination in Europe. In Christian Europe, the Janissaries became legendary and terrifying. Travelers wrote of their silence, their deadly precision, and their unwavering loyalty. Diplomats feared crossing them. Prisoners of war recounted stories of Janissary units operating with eerie coordination, firing in waves that sounded like thunder. Some even saw them as a symbol of a more modern form of war. While Christian armies were often unruly, divided by feudal loyalties and poorly supplied, the Janissaries appeared as a machine efficient, emotionless, invincible. To some European reformers, the Janissaries represented something to be copied. To others, they were the specter of Islamic dominance, proof that the East had surpassed the West in military organization. And then, how did the Janissaries change as the Ottoman Empire matured? Could such a rigid and elite force remain loyal and disciplined over generations? And what happens when a core built on fear, training, and separation from society begins to integrate into the very world it was meant to rise above? You stand in a bustling Istanbul marketplace in the late 16th century. Amidst the scent of spices and the clang of iron, a group of Janissaries stroll through the streets not in formation, but with the ease of civilians. They carry sabers, wear robes of fine cloth, and are greeted with deference. These are not the silent warriors of old. These are men of influence, property, and perhaps most importantly, politics. The transformation is nearly complete. Once humble captives molded into soldiers of the state, the Janissaries had now become a class of their own, powerful, entrenched, and increasingly entangled in the politics they were once meant to be detached from. From discipline to integration. The early centuries of Janissary history were defined by isolation and strict discipline. But over time, the walls between the Janissary barracks and civilian society began to crumble. Several key developments fueled this shift. Marriage and family. Though initially banned, by the late 16th century, Janissaries increasingly defied the restriction on marriage. Many took wives and raised families. Some even passed their positions to sons, an act once unthinkable in a system based on devshirme and selection, not inheritance. Property ownership. Janissaries began buying land, shops, and homes. They became landlords, merchants, and patrons of mosques. With property came power and influence in local governance. Urban settlement. Instead of living exclusively in barracks, many Janissaries chose to reside in cities. Istanbul, Thessaloniki, and Cairo had growing Janissary quarters. In some towns, they effectively ran the economy. This integration blurred the line between soldier and citizen and shifted the nature of the corps itself. Changing recruitment practices. The devshirme system, once the backbone of Janissary recruitment, began to falter in the late 16th century. Several factors contributed. Declining Christian populations in the Balkans, due to war, disease, and migration. Resistance and evasion villages increasingly resisted the devshirme collection. Local leaders bribed officials to exempt their children. Corruption and favoritism. Positions in the Janissary corps were now sometimes sold or awarded as political favors, rather than earned through training. By the early 17th century, many Janissaries were no longer converted Christian captives. They were Muslim-born Turks, Albanians, Bosniaks, and Arabs recruited informally, often without rigorous training. This shift eroded the ideological and religious unity that had once bound the corps. From sword to stakeholder, political influence grows. As their numbers and wealth grew, the Janissaries began exerting more direct political influence. In court politics, they became kingmakers. Sultans increasingly relied on Janissary support to ascend the throne or stay on it. In succession crises, Janissaries could determine outcomes by backing one prince over another. In the bureaucracy, retired janissaries filled positions in tax collection, city administration, and religious endowments. At times, their political involvement turned violent. Several sultans were deposed or murdered by the janissaries when they were seen as incompetent, disrespectful, or unwilling to meet their demands. Notably, in 1622, the janissaries murdered Sultan Osman II, who had tried to reform and reduce their power. In 1807, they forced the removal of Selim III, who had attempted to modernize the military. The Sultan's elite protectors had become a faction, and one not always loyal. The janissaries in Ottoman society. By the 17th century, the janissary corps had grown far beyond its original military function. Their numbers ballooned. Some estimates suggest over 100,000 janissaries were on the rolls, though many were inactive or nominal members. They became a kind of guild within society, with their own customs, economy, and internal politics. In the cities, janissaries ran coffee houses, some of which became centers of political dissent. They formed alliances with merchants and artisans, enforcing local price controls or intervening in disputes. In some neighborhoods, they acted as unofficial police, collecting protection money and settling disputes. This civic entrenchment gave them immense social capital. A janissary uniform, even worn by a retiree, conveyed prestige and immunity from certain taxes and punishments. For many Ottoman citizens, the janissaries were both protectors and predators. On the battlefield, declining effectiveness. As their political power rose, their battlefield prowess declined. Training standards dropped. New recruits were often poorly trained or lacked discipline. Gunpowder tactics stagnated. While European armies adapted to evolving technology and tactics, the janissaries clung to older models. Corruption undermined readiness. Some janissaries received pay without serving. Others took bribes to avoid deployment. The once formidable infantry, known for disciplined volleys and battlefield coordination, became a bloated and inefficient force still feared in name, but often unreliable in action. Not all janissaries had declined, of course. Some units retained their edge, but by the 18th century, most serious military efforts depended on irregulars, provincial troops, or naval power. The janissaries and the people. Despite their growing reputation for arrogance and lawlessness, the janissaries remained deeply embedded in Ottoman urban life. Many citizens saw them as necessary both for protection and for order. They were defenders of tradition against reform-minded sultans, mediators in local conflicts, symbols of Ottoman pride, particularly in cities where European influence was growing. When foreign envoys visited, janissaries often served as ceremonial guards. Their uniforms, music, and drills impressed and intimidated. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered, especially among reformers who saw the corps as the greatest obstacle to modernizing the empire. Cultural legacy. The janissaries left a deep mark on Ottoman art, literature, and music. Their Mater bands, with drums, flutes, and cymbals, became iconic, used to inspire troops, terrify enemies, and celebrate victories. European composers like Mozart and Beethoven even imitated janissary music in their works. Folk tales and poems celebrated janissary exploits. Visual depictions showed them in parades, on horseback, or receiving rewards from the Sultan. Yet over time, these images became nostalgic. The janissary of story and song was a shadow of the soldier who once scaled the walls of Constantinople. The empire's dilemma. By the early 19th century, the Ottoman state faced a dilemma. The janissaries were too powerful to ignore and too entrenched to reform. Their military value had diminished, but their political clout had not. Attempts to create modern armies, such as the Nizam Letter 131 Sadid or New Order forces, were crushed by Janissary revolts. The empire was caught between nostalgia and necessity, tradition and transformation. And the Sultanate would soon have to make a terrible choice. And then, what happens when a state must destroy the very institution that built it? How does an empire face down its own protectors now turned oppressors? And when the end comes, will it be swift, or will it ignite the final sparks of decline? It is the morning of June 15, 1826 in Istanbul. The air is thick with tension. In the streets near the Janissary barracks, drums beat and shouts ring out not in formation, but in revolt. The Sultan's new army, trained in European fashion, marches toward the square. The Janissaries, once the defenders of the Ottoman throne, now raise arms against it. By evening, thousands are dead. Fires rage. The city is silenced. The Janissary Corps, after centuries as the backbone of Ottoman might, has been eradicated in a single, violent stroke, a moment known as the auspicious incident. How did the elite soldiers of the Sultan fall so far that the empire was forced to destroy them? And what did this violent purge reveal about the Ottoman world itself? The prelude to destruction. By the 18th century, the Janissary Corps was no longer a disciplined military elite. It had become a hereditary guild, bloated in size and deeply resistant to change. Several trends sealed their fate. Internal decay. With recruitment no longer tied to devshirm or elite training, the Janissaries had lost their cohesion. Many were Janissaries in name, only farmers, artisans, even beggars who bought their way into the Corps for tax exemption and social protection. Resistance to reform. Ottoman rulers increasingly recognized the need for modernization. European powers had adopted new tactics, drilled armies, and efficient bureaucracies. The Janissaries opposed every serious attempt to reform the military or create parallel forces. Political rebellions. In several cases, the Janissaries acted as kingmakers or executioners. They deposed sultans, looted palaces, and suppressed reforms by force. They had become a state within the state. Every effort to retrain or reorganize them failed. But then a new sultan came to power. Mahmud II, the reformer sultan. Sultan Mahmud II, who ascended the throne in 1808, understood that the empire was dying and that the Janissaries were the infection blocking the cure. Tall, ambitious, and ruthless when needed, Mahmud was determined to break the cycle. He began slowly, methodically. He built secret training programs for a new army, the Asakiri Manjari Muhammadiyah, the victorious soldiers of Mohammed, modeled on European units. He gathered support from scholars, provincial governors, and religious authorities. He ordered new uniforms, modern weapons, and foreign advisors, all in preparation for a decisive break. But he waited. Mahmud knew the Janissaries would revolt. He needed them to fire the first shot. The auspicious incident, VAK letter to BFAI Hariyai. In June 1826, Mahmud announced a new training program for all soldiers, including the Janissaries. It was a transparent challenge. Predictably, the Janissaries revolted, barricading streets, beating drums, and demanding the Sultan abandon his reforms. This time, Mahmud did not flinch. He summoned the Shaykhul Islam, the empire's highest religious authority, and secured a fatwa declaring the Janissary uprising illegal and seditious. This gave him both religious and legal authority to act. Then the Sultan called on his loyal artillery corps and the new troops he had quietly trained. On June 15, the cannons opened fire on the Janissary barracks in Istanbul. The compound was reduced to rubble. Fires spread across the city. Those who tried to escape were hunted down. Many were executed without trial. Others were imprisoned or exiled. Within 2 days, the Janissary Corps, an institution more than 400 years old, was wiped out. Tens of thousands were killed or banished. Reactions and ripples. The event shocked the empire. The religious establishment, having supported the purge, quickly reinforced Mahmud's actions as divinely sanctioned. Provincial governors, long frustrated by Janissary interference, supported the move. Common citizens, weary of Janissary abuses and unchecked power, largely welcomed the change. Foreign observers in European embassies were stunned. One British diplomat wrote, "An institution that outlived the Crusades has been destroyed in a matter of hours." The auspicious incident, as it came to be known, marked both an end and a beginning. What was lost? While the Janissaries had become corrupt, their destruction also erased part of Ottoman identity. The Mater bands, the world's oldest military musicians, were silenced. Ceremonial traditions associated with Janissary parades, uniforms, and rituals vanished. Barracks and archives were burned, taking with them centuries of institutional memory. Some mourned, others feared the vacuum they left behind. But for Mahmud II, the path was clear. The empire must become modern or collapse. Rebuilding the army. With the Janissaries gone, Mahmud accelerated reform. European-style training was introduced across the new army. French and Prussian advisors helped organize military academies. New uniforms, resembling those of Napoleon's troops, replaced the old robes and turbans. The military began using standardized rifles and artillery, finally catching up with European powers. For the first time in centuries, the Ottoman army had a command structure, a clear chain of authority, and a chance at modernization. It wasn't perfect. Corruption still lingered. Training took years to bear fruit, but the fear of Janissary retaliation was gone. The shadow they left behind. Even in death, the Janissaries haunted the empire. Former Janissaries, hiding in towns or villages, sometimes led revolts or formed bandit groups, claiming to be the true soldiers of the Sultan. In conservative religious circles, the purge was seen as a betrayal of Ottoman tradition. In the provinces, rumors spread that Mahmud's reforms were un-Islamic, sowing dissent that would later fuel other uprisings. Still, Mahmud pushed on. He reformed not only the army but also taxation systems, provincial governance, the postal and census system. In many ways, the destruction of the Janissaries freed the Ottoman Empire from its own past, but it also marked the start of a difficult, often painful modernization journey. The historical irony. The Janissaries, once the most innovative and modern force of their time, had become the greatest obstacle to change. They were created to secure the empire and ended up nearly strangling it. They began as slaves but became kingslayers. They symbolized discipline but became lawless. They were the architects of Ottoman rise and the prisoners of Ottoman stagnation. Their fall is not just a tale of political reform. It is a warning about what happens when institutions forget their purpose and cling to privilege over duty. Modern memory. Today, the Janissaries are remembered in complex ways. In Turkey, they are taught as both heroes and cautionary tales. Their music survives, revived in military parades and cultural festivals. In Balkan folklore, they appear as feared soldiers and tragic figures, often both. Museums display their uniforms, weapons, and banners, telling the story of a military class that ruled not just with swords but with silence, structure, and symbolism. They live on not in barracks but in the architecture of the empire they helped build, the roads they guarded, and the laws they once enforced. Final reflection. The story of the Janissaries is one of contradictions. Created through forced servitude, they rose to supreme power. Trained to obey without question, they became the loudest voice in Ottoman politics. Built to be incorruptible, they fell to ambition and greed. Destroyed as relics of the past, they made way for a future they themselves would never have accepted. In the end, the Janissaries teach us that even the most powerful institutions must adapt or be swept away. So we must ask, what happens to an empire when its strongest sword becomes its deepest wound? Story 5. The Balkans under the Crescent, Daily Life in Ottoman Europe. You are a traveler, moving along a narrow road in the highlands of 17th century Bosnia. The air is thick with pine and smoke. You pass small hamlets where the roofs are tiled with stone, not clay. In one village, the church bell tolls for mass. In the next, the muezzin calls the faithful to prayer. A local Ottoman tax official passes you on horseback, flanked by guards in turbans and kaftans. A moment later, barefoot boys with wooden tools head for the fields, speaking a Slavic dialect you struggle to follow. This is Ottoman Europe, not the Sultan's palace or the Janissaries' parade ground, but the quiet, muddy, stubborn heartland of the empire. A patchwork of faiths and peoples. By the mid-16th century, the Ottoman Empire had consolidated its rule over much of the Balkans. This included modern-day Greece, Albania, North Macedonia, Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, and parts of Hungary and Croatia. The region was ethnically and religiously diverse. Orthodox Christians in Serbia, Bulgaria and Romania. Catholics in Croatia and parts of Bosnia. Muslims, including Turks, Albanians, and Slavic converts. Jews, many descended from families expelled from Spain in 1492, now thriving in Ottoman cities like Salonika. And remnants of older communities Bogomils, Vlachs, and Roma. The Ottoman system did not seek uniformity. It ruled through diversity, organizing society into millet autonomous religious communities under their own spiritual leaders. You paid your taxes, you kept the peace, and in return the state largely left your internal affairs alone. The timur system, land without ownership. Most Balkan lands were administered through the timur system, under this feudal-like arrangement. The Sultan granted land revenues, not ownership, to cavalry officers, Sipahis, in exchange for military service. The Sipahi had the right to collect taxes from local peasants, typically in grain, livestock, or labor. In theory, abuse was forbidden. In practice, it varied by region and personality. A peasant might never meet the Sultan, but he knew his Sipahi. This man might be fair and generous or a cruel collector. Regardless, the peasant was bound to the land, his survival dependent on rainfall, harvest, and a delicate relationship with his overlord. Village life and daily rhythms. The village was the center of life for most Balkan subjects. It was where people worked, prayed, married, and buried their dead. A typical village had 20 to 30 houses, usually wooden with stone bases. A communal oven for baking bread. A water source stream, well or cistern. Religious buildings, church, mosque, or both, depending on the area. Fields and pastures, cultivated collectively or by family units. Children worked from a young age. Women tended to livestock and spinning, while men plowed and harvested. Sundays or Fridays were rest days, depending on one's faith. Winters were long, famines were not rare, yet the rhythm of life persisted: birth, labor, prayer, death. The empire's high politics felt far away. Islam and conversion in the Balkans. The presence of Islam in Europe was not new, but under the Ottomans it became a structural feature, not a border anomaly. Conversions to Islam were gradual and regionally varied, motivated more by social and economic incentives than forced coercion. Especially common in Bosnia, Albania, and Kosovo, where Muslim populations eventually formed a majority. Converts often gained tax exemptions, not paying the jizya, the poll tax on non-Muslims, access to military careers, greater legal autonomy. However, conversions didn't always erase local identity. Many retained Slavic customs, languages, and regional dress. Islam in the Balkans took on a local flavor, mixing Ottoman practices with pre-Islamic traditions. Markets, coffeehouses, and caravan routes. Trade thrived in Ottoman Europe. Every town of note had a bazaar sarshi, a covered market filled with shops, craftsmen, and itinerant traders. Goods for sale might include spices from Egypt, textiles from Anatolia, wool from local shepherds, salt from Wallachian mines, coffee from Yemen, newly popular and brewed in small, steaming pots. The coffeehouse became a staple of urban life. Here, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish men gathered to drink bitter, dark coffee, read poetry, or listen to traveling storytellers, hear news from Istanbul, Vienna, or the Danube frontier, gamble, debate, and recite verses from memory. In some places, local authorities tried to ban coffeehouses, fearing sedition. In others, they merely taxed them. Religious coexistence and boundaries. The empire's policy of religious pluralism was pragmatic, not idealistic. Christians and Jews were tolerated but not equal. Muslims could bear arms and ride horses. Non-Muslims could not testify against Muslims in court. Church bells were often silenced in cities. New churches required special permission to build or repair. Despite this, there was little of the mass persecution seen in parts of Catholic Europe during the same period. Coexistence was real but unequal. There were also practical alliances. Christian village leaders might work closely with Muslim judges, cadis. Jewish physicians treated both Muslim beys and Christian bishops. Economic interdependence bred reluctant tolerance. Resistance and rebellion. Life under Ottoman rule was not always peaceful. Peasants sometimes rebelled against taxes, conscription, or abusive sipahi's. These were small local uprisings, usually crushed quickly. More serious threats came from Hajduks, Balkan outlaws, and resistance fighters, sometimes romanticized as freedom heroes. Clerical networks, Orthodox monasteries, and Catholic orders that kept alive nationalist sentiment. Foreign provocateurs, Habsburg or Venetian agents who sought to stir trouble behind Ottoman lines. Still, most villages could not afford rebellion. The cost of failure was too high: burned homes, beheaded leaders, displaced families. A forgotten Europe. To Western Europeans of the time, the Balkans were the edge of civilization, a place of ambiguity, where Christianity met Islam, where roads were muddy and loyalties uncertain. But to the Ottomans, this region was not a frontier. It was a core part of the empire, rich in grain, timber, and soldiers. Towns like Sarajevo, Skopje, and Plovdiv were provincial capitals, with mosques, baths, libraries, and bridges built by Ottoman architects. This part of Europe was not lost, just narrated differently. And yet, what happened when imperial rule began to decay? When reforms sparked resistance instead of loyalty? When the children of converts, peasants, and merchants began dreaming of independence, not coexistence? By the dawn of the 18th century, life in the Ottoman Balkans began to shift. What had once been a relatively stable, if unequal, mosaic of communities slowly unraveled under the weight of empire-wide transformation. Peasant villages still clung to tradition, but the larger forces, reform, economic disruption, and rising nationalism, began to intrude on even the quietest corners. The Ottomans had ruled the region for centuries, not through assimilation, but through delicate management. Now, that balance was under strain. The old pact of coexistence, unspoken, uneven, but workable, was beginning to crack. The Tanzimat reforms and their ripple effects. In 1839, the Ottoman state launched a series of sweeping changes known as the Tanzimat, reorganization, reforms. These reforms were inspired by European Enlightenment ideals and pressured by the empire's declining military and economic power. The state promised legal equality for all subjects, regardless of religion, reforms in taxation, aiming to curb corruption and exploitation, modern education systems, replacing religious schooling with state-controlled curricula, a modern army and bureaucracy trained in European fashion. In the Balkans, these reforms landed uneasily. To Muslim elites, local pashas, and sipahis, the reforms felt like betrayal. They eroded long-standing privileges and threatened their control over land and legal affairs. To Christian peasants, the reforms were confusing. The empire now promised equality, but local enforcement often lagged. A villager might hear in a distant town that he was now equal under law, only to find the local cadi, judge, still favoring Muslims. What's more, the new reforms weakened traditional structures, millets, religious courts, and village elders without fully replacing them. And into this vacuum stepped something new, the idea of the nation. Nationalism's quiet arrival. The Balkans had long been a borderland of cultures, not nations. Ethnic identity was secondary to religion, village loyalty, and local dialect. But in the 19th century, national consciousness began to form. This wasn't yet the loud nationalism of flag-waving armies, it was quieter. It spread through monasteries, where monks began teaching histories in the local tongue. Secret schools, where Greek, Bulgarian, Serbian, or Romanian was spoken instead of Ottoman Turkish. Folklore collections, preserving songs and tales that hinted at a noble past. Exiled intellectuals, often in Habsburg cities, who wrote histories and pamphlets claiming ancient roots. These movements grew slowly but steadily. Each story of a medieval kingdom, lost battle, or local martyr began to replace loyalty to the Sultan with loyalty to a forgotten nation. Economic strains and social changes. Economic transformation added pressure. The empire was increasingly drawn into global capitalist markets. In the Balkans, this meant the decline of local artisans, undercut by cheaper European imports. The commercialization of agriculture, shifting from subsistence farming to cash crops like tobacco and cotton. The emergence of a merchant class, often Christian, who began accumulating wealth and influence. These shifts created new class tensions. A peasant might lose his land to debt. A Muslim landlord might find himself resented by newly literate Christian merchants. Young men left villages for towns, where they encountered foreign ideas, different faiths, and eventually radical politics. Ottoman control was loosening not because of dramatic revolts, but through millions of small, slow acts of disconnection. The role of religion. Religion remained central to identity, but its role was changing. The Orthodox Church, long subordinate to the Ottoman state, became a vehicle for national identity. In Serbia, the church preserved medieval texts and saint cults. In Bulgaria, clerics pushed for a national patriarchate, separate from Greek dominance. In Romania, priests supported the revival of Latin linguistic roots. Meanwhile, Islam in the Balkans found itself increasingly isolated. Muslim communities, once dominant, now faced fear and suspicion. As nationalist movements grew, Muslims became targets of revenge, especially in places where they had once held power. Some Muslim families fled to Anatolia. Others tried to assimilate, but many were caught in the middle, no longer privileged, not fully trusted by either empire or nation. Revolts, risings, and retaliations. The 19th century saw a growing wave of rebellions, beginning with the first Serbian uprising in 1804 and followed by the Greek War of Independence, 1821–1830, the Bulgarian April Uprising, 1876, revolts in Herzegovina and Bosnia, mid to late 19th century, peasant revolts, often centered on taxation, conscription, or land disputes. These were not always clean nationalist movements. Often, they were driven by grievances over bread, land, and dignity. But over time, rebellion took on a nationalist tone. Fighters saw themselves not just as rebels, but as liberators of their people. The Ottoman response was typically brutal: burned villages, mass arrests, executions. But the pattern was clear. The Balkan peoples were no longer simply subjects. They were becoming citizens in waiting. Urban tensions and provincial cracks. Towns like Skopje, Monastir, Bitola, and Salonika became centers of tension. Here, the old and new worlds collided. Ottoman officials tried to maintain order using outdated bureaucracies. Foreign consulates stirred local unrest through spies and pamphlets. Newspapers in multiple languages, Turkish, Greek, Serbian, Ladino, spread competing visions of identity. In coffeehouses and churches, debates turned into skirmishes. No longer was the empire's hold unquestioned. In places where Orthodox priests once bowed to Ottoman governors, the tide had turned. In some towns, children no longer spoke Turkish. Flags of imaginary nations flew from balconies. Education as a revolutionary tool. The growth of national schools was one of the most important developments. In Bulgaria, the national revival movement built schools teaching in Bulgarian, not Greek or Turkish. In Serbia, intellectuals promoted Slavic heritage through grammar books and histories. In Romanian provinces, schooling focused on Latin roots and Western connections. Ottoman efforts to centralize education often failed in the face of local resistance. Teachers became revolutionaries. Textbooks became manifestos. Language became a weapon. A generation of children would grow up seeing the empire not as their protector, but as an obstacle to their identity. Uneasy coexistence in decline. Despite the upheaval, many Balkan communities still managed to live side by side. In some villages, Muslims and Christians still shared harvest festivals. Mixed neighborhoods remained peaceful. Old pacts of mutual aid and respect endured. But the cracks widened each year. Where once there was diversity under imperial tolerance, there was now suspicion. Where once people spoke in dialects and prayed in different ways, they now identified as nations, ethnicities, and enemies. The old Ottoman promise peace through difference was fading. And so, what happens when the very structure of society dissolves? How does a farmer, a blacksmith, or a village elder navigate a world where his past no longer guides his future? And what happens when empires try to adapt too late to the world they themselves created? It is the late 19th century, and the Ottoman hold on the Balkans is unraveling. In the towns, Christian schools outnumber Ottoman ones. In the countryside, the pashas no longer ride with authority. A child in Bulgaria knows more about Tsar Simeon than Sultan Abdul Hamid. In Serbia, boys memorize poems about medieval kings, not the conquests of Mehmet the Conqueror. The empire is still here technically, taxes are still collected, soldiers still patrol, the sultan still prays for his provinces. But for many, the Ottoman state has become a shadow. The end is not a moment. It is a slow erosion, a process of forgetting, resisting, and replacing. The decline of Muslim communities. As nationalist revolts succeeded and Christian-majority territories broke away, Ottoman Muslims in the Balkans faced an uncertain future. They had once been the ruling class: landholders, judges, tax officials. But with every shift in the border, their position became more precarious. In Serbia, 1830-60, Muslim elites were expelled or fled after independence. Many settled in Bosnia or Anatolia. In Greece, after 1830, mosques were closed or converted. Muslim communities diminished rapidly. In Bulgaria, post-1878, Muslims, including Turks, Pomaks, Muslim Slavs, and Roma, faced discrimination, land seizures, and occasional violence. Between 1780 and 1923, an estimated 5 to 7 million Muslims fled or were expelled from the Balkans. This became one of the largest movements of populations in modern European history, largely forgotten today. They brought with them Ottoman recipes and dialects, rural customs and folk songs, bitterness, displacement, and nostalgia for a world that no longer wanted them. In Anatolia, they were called Muassir's refugees. For them, the empire's fall was not political, it was personal. The Congress of Berlin and the partitioning of a region. In 1878, the Congress of Berlin formalized the dismemberment of the Ottoman Balkans. Key outcomes: Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro were recognized as independent states. Bosnia and Herzegovina were placed under Austro-Hungarian administration. Bulgaria became an autonomous principality. Ottoman control shrank to Albania, Macedonia, Kosovo, and parts of Thrace. This was not just redrawing borders, it was redefining identity. Villagers who had paid taxes to the Sultan now answered to European monarchs. Official languages changed. School books were rewritten. Churches gained new authority. But Ottoman habits lingered. Old Turkish words remained in village speech. Ottoman court traditions survived in Balkan bureaucracy. Coffee houses stayed open, still serving thick black brews in small porcelain cups. The empire was gone, but its imprint remained, etched into daily life. The Balkan Wars and the end of Ottoman Europe. Between 1912 and 1913, the Balkan Wars delivered the final blow. A coalition of Balkan states, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, launched a successful assault against the remaining Ottoman territories in Europe. Macedonia, Albania, and parts of Thrace were contested violently. The Ottomans lost almost all their European lands, except for a small strip near Istanbul. The wars were brutal, marked by atrocities on all sides, particularly against civilian populations. Muslim villages were burned, Christian towns were shelled. The dream of coexistence, fragile as it had been, was now utterly broken. In the wake of the wars, new national boundaries were drawn, often without regard for local demographics. Minorities became suspects. Old neighbors became strangers. The Ottoman Balkans were over. The rise of historical memory. With the empire's retreat, a new battle began, the battle for memory. Each emerging nation crafted its own story. Serbia celebrated its medieval kingdom and the 1389 Battle of Kosovo. Greece revived its ancient classical heritage, sidelining Ottoman centuries. Bulgaria remembered uprisings and liberation, not collaboration or coexistence. Romania emphasized Roman roots and Latin language over Ottoman influence. In these new histories, the Ottoman period was cast as a dark age, a time of occupation and backwardness, a period to be forgotten, not integrated. Mosques were demolished or abandoned. Ottoman buildings fell into disrepair. Turkish inscriptions faded. The centuries of shared life were erased or ignored. Yet memory proved stubborn. The persistence of culture. Even as official narratives pushed the empire into the past, daily life betrayed Ottoman fingerprints. Language. Balkan languages retain hundreds of Turkish loanwords, especially in food, clothing, and household items. Cuisine. Burek, baklava, dolma, and coffee are shared across cultures, though now claimed as national dishes. Architecture. Ottoman bridges, baths, and bazaars still stand in cities like Sarajevo, Skopje, and Plovdiv. Music, folk songs, and instruments show a blend of Slavic, Turkish, and Roma influences. Social customs. Greetings, hospitality, and rural rituals preserve older Ottoman manners. These legacies are often unacknowledged, but deeply rooted. An Albanian farmer, a Bosnian imam, A Greek grandmother, they all carry pieces of a shared Ottoman past, whether they admit it or not. What the empire meant. The Ottoman Empire ruled the Balkans not with unity, but with tolerance of fragmentation. It allowed different laws, languages, religions, and identities to coexist under a central authority, sometimes peacefully, sometimes with tension. This was neither full integration nor full segregation. It was something else, a system where difference was managed, not resolved. Its collapse revealed the costs of that model: the absence of a common civic identity, the fragility of peace based on hierarchy rather than consensus, the danger of repressed resentment when power shifts. In modern times, the Balkans have seen repeated attempts to craft national identity through exclusion. The Ottoman experience offers a counter-history, one of pluralism, ambivalence, and shared complexity. Echoes today. Walk the streets of Sarajevo and you'll see a mosque next to a synagogue, a church, and an old Ottoman inn. Turkish-style fountains still flowing. Streets named for both kings and sultans. Visit rural Macedonia, and an old woman might still bake bread in a sack, the same way her Ottoman ancestors did. Order coffee in Belgrade, and it will be strong, unfiltered, and served with sugar on the side, Turkish style, even if no one calls it that. The empire is gone, but its ghost lingers in gestures, flavors, and memories. And so, can an empire truly disappear, or does it simply dissolve into the cultures it once held? What does it mean when people forget what they once shared? And in the contested lands of modern Europe, how much of today's tension is built upon forgotten coexistence? Story 6: The Long Siege, Vienna, 1683. You are standing atop the walls of Vienna. It is September 1683. The sun is rising over the Danube River. Before you lies a sea of tents, cannons, horses, and banners. The sounds of drums echo in the early light. This is not a distant skirmish on a forgotten frontier. This is the Siege of Vienna. And it is the last great push of the Ottoman Empire into the heart of Europe. A city on the edge. Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg monarchy, was not just another city, it was a symbol of Christian Europe, of dynastic power, of a gateway between East and West. With a population of just over 100,000, Vienna was modest by today's standards, but it was vital. It sat at the northern edge of Ottoman influence, a target and a threat. The Ottomans had attempted to take the city once before in 1529. That attempt, led by Suleiman the Magnificent, had failed due to bad weather and poor logistics. But the memory remained, both in Vienna and in Istanbul. Now, in 1683, the empire returned with greater preparation and far grander ambitions. Why Vienna? Why now? The late 17th century was a period of shifting alliances and fragile borders. The Ottoman Empire, though past its golden age, was still one of the most powerful forces in the world. Its military strength, though decentralized, remained formidable. The reasons for the renewed campaign against Vienna were complex. Strategic pressure. The Ottomans wanted to solidify their hold over Hungary and push further into Central Europe. Religious framing. Some within the court in Istanbul still viewed the fight as a Gaza or holy war, though it was also deeply political. Internal politics. The Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, sought to secure his legacy with a decisive victory. Habsburg weakness. The Holy Roman Empire was fragmented, and the Austrian Habsburgs were overstretched. The Ottomans hoped for a quick campaign, siege the city, topple the defenders, and force concessions, or perhaps even control of the Danube corridor. The war drums were not just symbolic, they were strategic. The march of the Ottoman army. The army that approached Vienna in the summer of 1683 was massive, possibly numbering between 150,000 170,000 000 soldiers, though precise figures remain debated. It included elite janissaries, the professional infantry of the Ottoman state, Sipahi cavalry, drawn from the empire's feudal landholders, auxiliary troops, Tatars, Balkan volunteers, and contingents from Ottoman vassals like Moldavia and Wallachia, heavy artillery, hundreds of cannons and siege weapons, massive logistical support, engineers, cooks, armorers, and slaves. The army moved slowly, establishing camps as it went, following supply lines from Belgrade and beyond. Behind them, a mobile city of tents, merchants, cooks, and administrators kept the force running. It was a state on the move. By early July, they reached the outskirts of Vienna. The siege begins. The city's defenses were not ideal. Vienna had medieval walls, not the modern star forts of the Italian school. It had limited supplies. Its garrison was small, perhaps 11,000 to 15,000 defenders, plus several thousand militia and civilians. But it had two critical advantages. High morale. The city had repelled invaders before. A promise of relief. The Habsburgs had called on allies for help, including the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth under King Jan III Sobieski and several German princes. Still, as the siege began in mid-July, hopes were dim. Kara Mustafa Pasha ordered a methodical siege. Engineers dug saps trenches toward the walls, protected by wickerwork and earth. Mining operations aimed to detonate explosive beneath key bastions. Artillery barrages struck the city daily. Blockades cut off water, food, and outside communication. Inside, the Viennese rationed bread. Disease spread. Citizens built barricades. Bells no longer rang for mass, they were melted for cannonballs. The goal of the Ottomans was not to storm the city in a single blow. It was to bleed it, then take it cleanly. But delays would prove fatal. Kara Mustafa Pasha's dilemma. Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier and commander of the siege, was a man of ambition. He wore green robes during campaigns, a color associated with the Prophet, and had coins struck in his name. He hoped to capture Vienna intact, not pillaged, to present it as a jewel of his own making. But this caution, some called it arrogance, slowed progress. He refused to let his troops sack the suburbs. He delayed major assaults in favor of long-term attrition. He underestimated the relief forces gathering to the west. His plan depended on time, but time, as the defenders and his enemies knew, was not infinite. Inside the besieged city, life within Vienna grew increasingly desperate. Food stores dwindled. Disease ravaged civilians and soldiers alike. Morale, however, held in part due to daily religious ceremonies and the leadership of Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg. Bells rang for prayer, and sermons framed the siege as a test of faith. Reports say children were put to work as messengers, women organized supplies, and makeshift hospitals were set up in cloisters. The population became unified by necessity. Survival bred resilience. Relief forces on the horizon. Unknown to the Ottomans, or at least not fully anticipated, the Christian coalition was moving swiftly. At the heart of this effort was Jan III Sobieski, the King of Poland, who commanded roughly 20,000 Polish troops, including the famed winged Hussars heavy cavalry with distinctive feathered wings on their backs. Joined by Imperial Habsburg forces, Saxons, Bavarians, and volunteers from various German states, the relief force numbered over 70,000 men. By early September, they approached Vienna, marching through the Vienna woods. They moved under the cover of night, setting up positions on the Kahlenberg Heights. The Ottomans had failed to secure the surrounding hills, an oversight that would prove devastating. The calm before the storm. As the Christian coalition prepared for battle, the Ottomans intensified their efforts. By September 11, The outer walls of Vienna were dangerously thin. Several bastions were damaged, and mines had already collapsed parts of the defenses. An assault was imminent, but so too was the counterstrike. On September 12, one of the largest battles in early modern Europe would erupt on the hills and plains outside Vienna. The siege had lasted 2 months. The end would come in a single day. And so, what happens when ambition exceeds strategy? When an empire at its edge meets a coalition that should have been too late? And what role does a single battle play in shaping centuries of fear, memory, and division? At dawn on September 12, 1683, the fields west of Vienna were cloaked in morning mist. The grass was wet, the air still. From the hills of the Kahlenberg, 70,000 Allied soldiers, Poles, Austrians, Germans stood silently in formation, their breath rising in clouds. In the distance below, tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers were encamped, unaware of how close the relief force had come. They would soon learn. This was the beginning of the Battle of Vienna, the moment when the balance between East and West shifted, not with a whisper, but with the thunder of hooves and cannon fire. The coalition forces assemble. The Christian coalition was an unusual alliance, hastily formed and born more of necessity than unity. It was led by King Jan III Sobieski of Poland, a monarch of military experience and considerable charisma. The coalition included Polish troops, including the famous winged hussars, heavy cavalry that were more myth than man to many. Austrian imperial troops, weakened but determined to reclaim their capital. Bavarians, Saxons, and Swabians, regional forces called up under the broader banner of Christendom. Each contingent had its own command structure, banners, languages, and loyalties. But for this one day, they would fight as one. And they would fight from above a tactically superior position, commanding the ridgelines overlooking the Ottoman encampment. Kara Mustafa Pasha's critical oversight. The Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, had made a serious error. His siege lines were oriented toward the city, not the hills behind him. He assumed the Habsburg allies were too far away to intervene. He left the heights of the Kahlenberg largely undefended. His forces were dispersed, focused on undermining the city's defenses rather than defending their own position. On the morning of September 12, reports of strange movements in the hills reached Ottoman scouts. But by the time the scale of the threat was realized, it was too late to reposition the army. The siege had become a trap. The battle begins. At 6:00 a.m., the Allies opened with artillery. Cannonades from the hills echoed down the valleys, announcing the start of battle. Polish, Austrian, and German infantry began descending the slopes, engaging Ottoman outposts. The Ottomans responded with their own artillery and cavalry, but were ill-prepared for a pitched battle on 2 fronts against Vienna from the east and the hills to the west. Austrian and German infantry attacked the Ottoman left flank. Polish forces under Sobieski held the center and right, waiting for the critical moment. Vienna's garrison, sensing the battle outside, launched coordinated sorties from within, attacking the Ottoman rear. The Ottomans were being squeezed caught between the relief force and the city they had nearly conquered. The siege lines crumbled into chaos. The charge of the winged hussars. The most iconic moment came in the late afternoon. As Ottoman lines buckled under pressure, King Sobieski ordered the final blow, a massive cavalry charge of over 20,000 horsemen, including 3,000 Polish winged hussars. The winged hussars were unlike any cavalry in Europe. Tall, heavily armored riders. Long lances, far exceeding the reach of Ottoman sabers. Decorative wings of wood and feathers, designed to intimidate and to whistle as they charged. They surged down the hills in what would become the largest cavalry charge in European history. The Ottoman ranks shattered, many ran, Some fought desperately, but the cohesion of the siege army was lost. Kara Mustafa Pasha fled, leaving behind his tents, treasury, and sacred banner, the Sancak letter 131 Sheriff, the alleged standard of the Prophet Muhammad. The siege of Vienna was over. Aftermath of the battle. Vienna had been saved, but at a terrible cost. The city was ravaged by months of siege, infrastructure damaged, disease rampant, and stores depleted. Thousands of Viennese civilians had died, along with untold numbers of Ottoman soldiers. The Ottoman army had been utterly routed, losing artillery, supplies, and prestige. But perhaps the greatest loss was symbolic. The Ottoman Empire had pushed deep into Central Europe, laying siege to the capital of a major Christian power, and had failed. Worse, it had been beaten back by a coalition that, until recently, had been fragmented and uncertain. For Kara Mustafa Pasha, the price was final. On his return to Istanbul, he was executed by order of the Sultan, strangled with a silk cord in December 1683. The empire needed a scapegoat. He was it. The broader war, the Holy League and the Great Turkish War. The Battle of Vienna was not the end, but the beginning of a longer unraveling. In 1684, the Holy League was formed, a formal alliance of the Habsburgs, Poland, Venice, and eventually Russia, dedicated to driving the Ottomans from Europe. This became known as the Great Turkish War, 1683–1699, a bloody and complex conflict that resulted in the capture of Buda, 1686, and the reclaiming of much of Hungary by the Habsburgs, the liberation of Transylvania, major defeats for the Ottomans in Slavonia, Croatia, and Serbia. The war would end with the Treaty of Karlovitz in 1699, a landmark agreement that marked the first major territorial loss for the Ottoman Empire to European powers. It was the beginning of the end of Ottoman expansion into Europe. The human cost. The political ramifications were vast, but the human cost was equally staggering. Villages burned, crops destroyed, populations displaced. Religious retaliation. In some recaptured areas, Muslims were expelled or forced to convert. In others, Orthodox Christians were caught between Habsburg Catholicism and Ottoman Islam. Cultural erasure. Mosques were torn down or turned into churches. Ottoman inscriptions were defaced. This was not just the end of a siege. It was the rewriting of the map and of memory. The legacy of the sea. Vienna's successful defense became a powerful symbol for Christian Europe. Over the centuries, it would be mythologized in art, song, and nationalist history. Church bells rang across Europe in celebration. The date, September 12, was commemorated as a day of victory. The event came to symbolize the defense of Western civilization against the East, a narrative still invoked, sometimes problematically, in modern times. But the siege also entrenched fear. Anti-Ottoman sentiment hardened in Central Europe. Islam came to be seen not just as a rival religion, but as a political and existential threat. The borderlands, particularly in Hungary and the Balkans, became zones of militarized identity and suspicion. The 1683 siege was the last time the Ottomans would threaten the gates of Central Europe. But the ghost of the crescent at Vienna's walls would cast a long shadow. And so, how do you measure the impact of a single day in the sweep of centuries? Can a city's survival reshape a continent's sense of self? And what do we inherit from a world where alliances are built from desperation, and where victory, too, can be a burden? When the last Ottoman soldier disappeared beyond the horizon and the smoke cleared from the plains of Vienna, Europe exhaled. The city had survived. The siege was over. But long after the bodies were buried and the cannonballs removed from the ruined facades, the true impact of 1683 would ripple outward. The battle was not just the dramatic end to a siege, it marked the beginning of a slow reversal in the fortunes of the Ottoman Empire and the reconfiguration of Europe's balance of power. This was the turning point, the high-water mark. After Vienna, the Ottomans would never again threaten the heart of Europe. And yet the ghosts of that campaign would linger in politics, culture, religion, and collective memory. The Treaty of Karlowitz, 1699. 16 years after the Battle of Vienna, a formal end to the larger conflict was reached with the Treaty of Karlowitz. For the first time, the Ottoman Empire ceded large amounts of territory to Christian powers. The implications were enormous. Austria gained Hungary, Transylvania, and parts of Croatia. Poland reclaimed Podolia. Venice secured parts of Dalmatia and the Peloponnese. This was not just a diplomatic loss, it was a blow to the Ottoman ideology of unceasing expansion, known as Sihad Jihad. The empire, once an ever-advancing force, was now being rolled back. The Ottoman court began to shift its focus inward. Administrators, wary of further military losses, favored diplomacy, internal reform, and cautious governance. A psychological turning point had been reached. Europe was no longer on the defensive. Cultural crossroads in Vienna. Even in victory, Vienna absorbed traces of the culture it had resisted. Coffee, the most famous legend from the siege tells of Ottoman coffee stores left behind and discovered by the Viennese. A Polish officer named Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki is credited with opening Vienna's first coffee house. Whether apocryphal or not, it marks the beginning of Vienna's long-standing coffee culture. Architecture. Some Ottoman tents, artifacts, and textiles were repurposed or imitated in European courts and salons. Turkish design elements became fashionable. Music and clothing. Ottoman-style turbans, robes, and instruments briefly entered European fashion, particularly in Austria and France. The Turquerie style became a courtly curiosity. Thus, even in defeat, the Ottoman presence left an aesthetic mark, a paradox of cultural fascination, emerging from political confrontation. Islam and the Christian imagination. The Siege of Vienna had long-lasting effects on how Islam was viewed in the Christian world. For centuries after, the event was invoked as a defining moment of Christian survival, a civilizational boundary between the West and the Islamic world, a rallying point for future nationalist and religious movements. In Austria, Hungary, and Poland, tales of the siege became central to national myths. Schoolchildren learned of King Sobieski as the savior of Europe. Paintings, poems, and operas depicted the siege in stark moral terms: light against darkness, cross against crescent. The Ottoman forces were often reduced to caricature, cruel, exotic, and absolute in their difference. Of course, the real Ottomans were more complex, an empire of Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Arabs, and Slavs, bureaucrats, poets, and soldiers alike. But after Vienna, nuance was no longer fashionable. Fear had simplified things. The Ottomans after Vienna. Internally, the Ottoman Empire began a long process of stagnation and reform. The military system faltered. The Janissaries, once elite, became politicized and conservative. Territorial control weakened. Peripheral regions grew more autonomous. Naval dominance slipped. The Mediterranean was now largely controlled by Christian fleets. Technological and industrial innovations lagged behind European states. There were reform attempts, especially under sultans like Selim II and Mahmud II, but they were often undermined by internal resistance. The empire endured for 2 more centuries, but its role in Europe became increasingly symbolic, a rival to contain, not one to fear. The memory of 1683 in modern politics. The battle's legacy has resurfaced again and again in modern history. During 19th century nationalism, Vienna became shorthand for the defense of European civilization. During the Cold War, ideological maps were often drawn with similar east-west binaries. In the 21st century, some far-right political movements in Europe and the US have referenced 1683 as a supposed clash of civilizations, moment often ignoring the complex, multicultural reality of the time. In 2001, following the September 11 attacks, some extremists referenced September 11th, 1683, the date of the Ottoman defeat. The symbolism was deliberate and troubling, an attempt to manipulate history into justification for present-day violence. But this misuse reveals something deeper. The Siege of Vienna remains a powerful myth, even now. Forgotten stories, the civilians, the builders, the survivors. Amid the grand battles and famous names, quieter lives are often forgotten. The Ottoman engineers, many of Balkan or Armenian origin, who dug tunnels beneath Vienna's walls. The Viennese civilians who cooked soup in church basements, nursed wounded soldiers, and prayed nightly in fear. The Muslim camp followers, traders and cooks who would never return home. The Janissaries, many of whom were originally Christian boys taken in the Devshirme system, now fighting for an empire that shaped their identities. These are the people who built, survived, and died in the shadow of empires. Their stories are harder to find in textbooks, but they are no less real. Echoes in the city. Today, Vienna is a city of music, palaces, and quiet cafes. But its geography still tells the story. Kahlenberg Hill, where Sobieski launched his charge, is marked with a plaque and Polish memorials. Ottakring and Favoriton, neighborhoods in modern Vienna, have large immigrant communities, including Turkish and Balkan families, descendants, perhaps, of the same regions once arrayed outside the city walls. The Augustinian bastion, once part of the city's defenses, has vanished beneath modern streets, but its outline remains in maps and old prints. The city no longer fears siege, but it remembers it. The value of the boring details. In the end, the Siege of Vienna is often remembered for its heroism and scale, but it is the small, structural details that shaped history. The slow pace of Ottoman logistics, delayed by carts and poor roads. The miscommunication between Kara Mustafa and his vassals. The tight food rations in Vienna, calculated day by day. The rain that ruined the gunpowder stores before an assault. The whispered rumors inside both camps, carried by spies and deserters. These are the boring, logistical, infrastructural details of history. And yet, they determine the outcome more than poetry or prophecy ever could. And so, what do we carry forward from a siege no one thought would succeed? Are empires undone by cannonballs or by delay, weather, and assumptions? And when we inherit memory, do we inherit the facts or the fears?